Hey guys, tonight we venture into the tragic legend of Sanguinius, the great angel, the most beloved of the Emperor's 20 sons, the perfect Primarch who, against the corrupting whispers of chaos itself, chose the ultimate sacrifice over his own survival. From his discovery on the irradiated wastelands of Baal to his final heroic stand aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, his story is one of nobility, brotherhood, and the terrible price of perfection. So before we dive into the warp, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're interested in God of War lore, do visit my channel Spartan Slumber. I've added the link in the description below. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the galaxy's darkest secrets. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey through the stars together. In the dying moments of the siege of Terra, as the Imperium teetered on the brink of absolute annihilation, a lone figure with broken wings lay bleeding on the cold metal deck of the Vengeful Spirit. The perfect son, the angel of Baal, Sanguinius, drew his final breaths while his brother Horus, now a daemon prince of unimaginable power, stood over him with bloodied claws. The angel's golden hair was matted with crimson, his magnificent wings torn and shattered, yet even in death, his face held an expression of peace, for he had made the choice that would save the Imperium, a choice that would damn his own sons for 10,000 years to come. But how did it come to this? How did the most noble of all the Primarchs, beloved by his brothers, worshipped by mortals, find himself facing the ultimate betrayal? The answer lies not in weakness, but in a strength so pure that it became his greatest vulnerability. Sanguinius was perfection incarnate. Where other Primarchs excelled in specific areas, the angel mastered them all. He possessed Horus's charisma, Guilliman's strategic mind, the Khan's speed, Dawn's resolve, and Russ's fury, all wrapped in a form so beautiful that mortal humans wept upon seeing him. His very presence inspired hope in the darkest of times. When the great angel arrived at a battlefield, even the most hardened Imperial Guard regiments would cheer and fight with renewed vigor, believing that victory was assured. Yet beneath this divine exterior lurked a curse so terrible that it threatened to destroy everything he held dear. For Sanguinius carried within his very genes a flaw that would manifest not just in himself, but in every son who bore his genetic legacy. The red thirst, they would come to call it, an uncontrollable hunger for blood that turned angels into monsters, and worse still, the black rage, a madness that would consume his warriors, making them relive his final moments over and over until death claimed them. The cruel irony was that Sanguinius knew, through prophetic visions granted by his psychic gifts, he saw his own death approaching like a tide of darkness. He witnessed the moment when Horus's talons would pierce his heart, felt the agony of his wings being torn away, experienced the cold touch of death on the deck of the War Master's flagship. And with each vision, he was presented with the same choice: warn the Emperor of the trap and live, or remain silent and die to ensure humanity's survival. Some might call it fate, others might call it the cruelest joke of the Chaos Gods, but Sanguinius was perhaps the only Primarch who could never turn to chaos. His soul burned too bright, his love for humanity too pure. Where Horus fell to pride, where Fulgrim succumbed to pleasure, where Mortarion was consumed by despair, the angel remained untouchable. And that purity would be both his salvation and his doom. But the angel's perfection hid a terrible curse that would demand blood, madness, and ultimately the ultimate sacrifice. For in the grim darkness of the far future, even angels must fall, so that humanity might rise. To understand the tragedy of Sanguinius, we must first journey back to an age when the galaxy burned with the light of hope, rather than the fires of war. The Great Crusade was in its golden dawn, and the Emperor of mankind strode among the stars with purpose absolute. This was the late 30th millennium, a time when humanity looked outward to reclaim its birthright among the stars. The Emperor's grand vision was nothing short of miraculous. For 15,000 years, humanity had cowered in the darkness of old night, isolated on countless worlds by warp storms and alien predation. But now, with the Astronomicon lighting the way and the Imperial truth spreading across the galaxy, mankind would be united under one banner. No more would humans worship false gods or bow to alien masters. The galaxy would know the glory of human dominion. Central to this vision were the Primarchs, 20 genetically crafted demigods who would serve as the Emperor's generals in this great endeavor. Each was designed to embody specific aspects of warfare and leadership, created from the Emperor's own genetic template, but enhanced beyond the limits of mortal flesh. They were to be perfect, each in their own way, leading vast armies of transhuman warriors across the void. But the dark gods of chaos would not allow such perfection to exist unchallenged. In a single night of sorcery and malice, they scattered the infant Primarchs across the galaxy, casting them through the warp to distant worlds where they would grow up far from their father's guidance. Some landed on worlds that would shape them into noble leaders. Others fell to planets that would twist them into monsters. The scattering was not random, but guided by malevolent intelligence, each Primarch placed where they would either serve Chaos's purposes or be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Among all these scattered sons, one fell to a world that seemed designed to create the perfect warrior saint. Baal Secundus was a death world, in the truest sense, a planet scoured by radiation and toxic storms, where only the strongest could survive. The twin worlds of the Baal system, Baal Secundus, had once been paradise planets during humanity's dark age of technology, covered in lush forests and crystal-clear oceans. Archaeological evidence suggests they had been centers of learning and culture, their libraries containing knowledge that would make even the Mechanicus weep with envy. But atomic fire had transformed paradise into hell. The radioactive winds that constantly swept across Baal Secundus carried death to all they touched, mutating the survivors into grotesque parodies of humanity. The few pure strain humans who remained, calling themselves the Blood, lived in fortified settlements and underground bunkers, emerging only when necessary to hunt for food or defend their territories. They had developed a culture of blood rituals and ancestor worship, believing that by drinking the blood of their enemies, they could absorb their strength and courage. It was into this harsh world that the infant Primarch fell, his gestation pod screaming through the toxic atmosphere like a falling star. When the Blood found the pod, they discovered something unprecedented, a child who was not merely human, but something far greater. Even as an infant, his beauty was evident, unmarked by the radiation that scarred all others. And as he grew, wings began to sprout from his shoulders, pure white feathers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The people of Baal had forgotten much during the long centuries of isolation, but they remembered the old stories of angels, divine messengers who would one day come to deliver the faithful. When they looked upon this winged child who grew with impossible speed and showed strength that defied belief, they knew their legends had come to life. They named him Sanguinius, the Sanguine One, and from his earliest days he was worshipped as much as he was loved. But Baal's influence was not entirely benevolent. The constant exposure to radiation and toxic chemicals had affected more than just the planet's environment. The very genetic structure of life on Baal had been altered at the fundamental level. The blood rituals practiced by the inhabitants were not merely cultural traditions but biological necessities. Something in the planet's corrupted ecosystem created an insatiable hunger for blood, a craving that could temporarily be satisfied but never truly cured. As Sanguinius grew to adolescence, displaying the superhuman development common to all Primarchs, he began to experience strange visions. At first, they seemed like dreams or hallucinations brought on by the planet's toxic atmosphere. He saw great fleets of ships crossing the void, armies of warriors in crimson armor, and always, his own death at the hands of someone he loved. The visions were fragmentary and confusing, but they shared one common element: blood. Oceans of it flowing like rivers through his dreams. The irradiated world would shape more than just his body, for the toxic environment had begun to work its influence on his very genes. The pure genetic template created by the Emperor was being subtly altered by Baal's harsh conditions. What had been designed as perfection was slowly developing flaws, microscopic changes that would not manifest fully until much later, but were already being written into his genetic code. Ancient rituals hid a darkness that called to noble blood, for the inhabitants of Baal had unknowingly discovered something that would prove crucial to their survival. The blood-drinking ceremonies were not mere superstition, but had tapped into something fundamental about the world's biology. The radiation had created a symbiotic relationship between the planet and its inhabitants. To survive on Baal, one needed more than just pure genetics. One needed to partake of the world's crimson essence. As young Sanguinius reached physical maturity, standing 9 feet tall, with wings that could span 30 feet, when fully extended, the full implications of his homeworld began to manifest. The angelic beauty that made mortals weep was real and undeniable, but so too was the hunger that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He found himself drawn to the sight of blood, fascinated by its scent and texture in ways that disturbed his noble soul. What emerged from Baal would be both salvation and curse, for Sanguinius embodied the duality of his homeworld. He was the angel that the people had prayed for, beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, and possessed of a nobility that could inspire the greatest acts of heroism. But he was also the child of a poisoned world, carrying within him the seeds of a hunger that would plague his bloodline for 10 millennia. The radiation of Baal had not weakened him, but had instead created something unprecedented, a Primarch whose very perfection contained the genesis of its own destruction. The stage was set for one of the galaxy's greatest tragedies, though none who looked upon the angel in those early days could have imagined the price that his nobility would eventually demand. The crash that brought Sanguinius to Baal Secundus was witnessed by 3 separate tribes of the blood, each believing they had seen a falling star that would bring either salvation or doom. The gestation pod, still warm from its journey through the warp, had carved a crater nearly 100 meters wide in the hardened earth of the Ash Desert. When the tribal scouts approached, expecting to find valuable metals or perhaps ancient technology, they discovered something that would reshape their entire world. Inside the pod lay an infant, unlike anything they had ever seen. While all children of Baal were born showing some effects of radiation, this child was perfect. His skin was unmarked by the mutations that plagued even the purest bloodlines. And as the tribal shamans examined him, they noticed something extraordinary. Tiny wing buds were already visible on his shoulder blades, and his eyes held a depth of intelligence that seemed impossible for one so young. The blood tribes had maintained their pure human genetics through careful breeding and religious devotion, but even they showed subtle signs of their world's influence. Sanguinius showed none. More than that, he seemed to radiate a sense of peace that calmed even the most battle-hardened warriors. The tribal leaders, hardened by generations of survival warfare, found themselves weeping as they looked upon him. Within days of his discovery, the infant began showing the accelerated development common to all Primarchs. By his first week, he was walking. By his first month, he was speaking in complete sentences, his voice carrying a musical quality that made even the harshest commands sound like poetry. The shamans declared him a gift from their ancestors, the angels spoken of in their oldest songs. But it was the wings that truly marked him as divine. As Sanguinius grew from infant to child in the space of months, the wing buds developed into magnificent appendages covered in snow-white feathers. Each feather seemed to capture and reflect light, creating an aura around him that was visible even in the perpetual twilight of Baal's dust storms. When he first took flight at the age of 2 standard years, appearing physically as a young man of 20, the entire tribe fell to their knees. The unification of the blood began not through conquest, but through pilgrimage. Word of the angels spread across the radiation wastes faster than any tribal messenger could travel. Pure strain humans who had never left their settlements began making dangerous journeys across hundreds of kilometers of toxic wasteland just to see him. They came expecting a symbol of hope and found something far greater, a leader who combined the wisdom of their greatest shamans with the strength of their mightiest warriors. Sanguinius possessed an innate understanding of leadership that seemed to come from genetic memory rather than learned experience. He could see the pride and fear that drove tribal conflicts, the desperation that made the blood cling so fiercely to their pure genetics while despising the mutants who shared their world. Rather than simply declaring himself their ruler, he spent months living among different tribes, learning their customs and understanding their grievances. The first test of his leadership came when the chaos cults of Baal launched their greatest offensive in centuries. These were not the simple mutants that raided settlements for supplies, but organized armies of grotesquely altered humans who worshipped the dark gods and sought to corrupt or destroy the remaining pure strain population. Led by beings so mutated, they barely retained human form. They swept across 3 tribal territories in a coordinated assault that would have spelled doom for the blood. Sanguinius met them at the Battle of Angels Fall, a narrow canyon that served as the only passage between the tribal lands and the great mutant cities. The young Primarch had convinced 5 separate tribes to fight together, something that had not happened in living memory. But even united, they were vastly outnumbered by the Chaos forces. The battle itself became the stuff of legend. Sanguinius fought like a being possessed, his spear cutting through mutant champions as if they were paper, his wings carrying him above the battlefield to strike wherever the fighting was thickest. But it was not just his combat prowess that won the day. He seemed to inspire supernatural courage in his followers, transforming frightened tribal warriors into heroes who fought with absolute faith in their angel. Yet it was during this battle that the first signs of the curse began to manifest among his followers. Several blood warriors, wounded and desperate, began displaying an uncontrollable hunger for the blood of their fallen enemies. They fought with a savagery that bordered on madness, tearing at corpses with their teeth and drinking deeply of crimson vitae. Sanguinius himself felt the hunger rising within him as the battle reached its climax, a thirst that no amount of water could quench. The victory was complete, but the cost was higher than anyone realized. The warriors who had succumbed to the blood hunger became the first to experience what would later be known as the Red Thirst. They remained loyal to Sanguinius, but something fundamental had changed in them. They required regular offerings of blood to remain stable, and their eyes held a hunger that never fully disappeared. Following the victory, the remaining tribes flocked to Sanguinius's banner. The angel established his capital in the ruins of an ancient city, its massive cathedral-like structures suggesting it had once been a place of worship during humanity's golden age. The buildings were constructed from a crystalline material that could not be reproduced, their architecture following geometric patterns that seemed to enhance natural acoustics and light. This became the foundation of the great cathedral, which Sanguinius ordered rebuilt and expanded using techniques that combined ancient knowledge with tribal craftsmanship. The cathedral became more than just a palace or fortress. It was a symbol of hope, its spires reaching toward the toxic sky, as if calling to something greater beyond the perpetual storms. The reconstruction project revealed the depth of Sanguinius's vision. Rather than simply fortifying against attacks, he designed a city that could serve as a beacon for all the pure-strain humans of BAA. The cathedral's central spire contained chambers where tribal shamans could practice their blood rituals under controlled conditions, while vast archives were established to preserve the oral histories of all the tribes. But the angel's followers began showing disturbing signs that could not be ignored. The Red Thirst was spreading, not through infection but through some deeper connection to Sanguinius himself. Warriors who spent too much time in his presence found themselves craving blood with increasing intensity. Those who had never participated in the traditional blood rituals began requesting permission to drink from the sacred chalices. Sanguinius recognized that his very presence was somehow catalyzing changes in his followers' biology. The psychic bond that allowed him to inspire such courage was also transmitting something darker. His own genetic code, altered by Baal's radiation, was influencing those who pledged themselves to his service. The hunger he had learned to control in himself was manifesting in others with frightening intensity. A hunger that no amount of victory could satisfy had taken root among the blood. The traditional rituals that had once been occasional ceremonies became daily necessities for many warriors. The angel watched with growing concern as his most devoted followers transformed from noble warriors into beings who fought with bestial fury whenever blood was spilled. Yet for all his growing awareness of the curse he carried, Sanguinius could not bring himself to abandon his people. They needed him not just as a leader, but as a symbol that purity could survive in a poisoned world. The tribes that had once fought bitter wars over scarce resources now worked together to build something greater than any of them could achieve alone. The expansion beyond Baal Secundus came naturally as the Angel's reputation grew. Neighboring systems began receiving visits from winged warriors who spoke of a perfect leader who could unite scattered human populations under one banner. These emissaries, themselves beginning to show the early stages of the Red Thirst, carried with them both hope and an unconscious hunger that would prove increasingly difficult to hide. The Emperor's arrival would change everything. But until that moment came, Sanguinius ruled over a growing empire built on faith, nobility, and a terrible secret that grew stronger with each passing day. His visions of the future became clearer and more frequent, showing him fleets of ships crossing the void and armies bearing his heraldry, but always ending with the same image of his own death at the hands of someone he loved. The Emperor's arrival at Baal came not with fanfare or grand announcements, but with the subtle shifting of reality itself. Those sensitive to psychic emanations felt his presence days before the golden ships appeared in the system's outer reaches. Sanguinius experienced the approach as a pulling sensation in his soul, as if a part of him that had been incomplete was finally being drawn toward its missing half. The Imperial fleet that entered the Baal system was unlike anything the inhabitants had ever imagined. Massive warships that dwarfed even the ancient derelicts scattered across the system's asteroid fields moved through space with impossible grace. Each vessel was a work of art, as much as an instrument of war, their hulls bearing the aquila of the nascent Imperium and inscribed with high Gothic prayers that seemed to glow with their own light. Sanguinius knew, with a certainty that came from his prophetic gifts, that his true father had come for him. The visions that had plagued him since childhood suddenly gained new clarity. This was the master of mankind, the emperor who would unite the galaxy under human rule. Every dream of vast fleets and crimson-armored warriors was about to become reality. The meeting between father and son took place, not in the throne room of the great cathedral, but on the highest spire where Sanguinius waited alone as the emperor's personal shuttle descended through Baal's toxic atmosphere. When the master of mankind emerged from his craft, Sanguinius felt a recognition so profound it brought him to his knees. This was not just reunion but homecoming, the completion of a bond that had been forged in the deepest laboratories beneath Terra decades earlier. The emperor appeared as a figure of impossible nobility, his features seeming to shift between different faces depending on the angle of observation, yet always maintaining an essential perfection that made mortal eyes water to look upon directly. He was tall, even by Primarch standards, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions mortal minds could not perceive. Their first conversation lasted 7 hours and covered topics that would have taken scholars' lifetimes to explore. The Emperor explained the Great Crusade, the necessity of reclaiming humanity's scattered children, and Sanguinius's role as one of his primary generals. But beyond the grand strategic concerns, there was something deeply personal in their exchange. The Emperor had found not just a weapon but a son who embodied everything noble about humanity's potential. Sanguinius's immediate loyalty was absolute, but it came with a confession that took tremendous courage. He revealed the growing curse among his followers, the red thirst that transformed noble warriors into blood-maddened killers. He expected disappointment, perhaps even rejection. Instead, the emperor listened with the patience of one who had seen the darkest secrets of human nature and accepted them as part of the price of progress. The solution the emperor proposed was both elegant and terrible. The Blood Angels Legion would be created using Sanguinius's gene seed, but recruitment would be carefully controlled. Only candidates with the strongest mental discipline would be chosen, and they would be trained not just in warfare, but in controlling the hunger that came with their enhanced genetics. The curse would not be eliminated, but channeled, transformed from weakness into strength. The formal incorporation into the Great Crusade began with the arrival of the Legion's support fleet. Massive forged ships carried the equipment necessary to establish recruitment facilities on Baal, while transport vessels brought master sergeants from other legions who would serve as training cadre until enough Blood Angels could be promoted to leadership positions. The transformation of tribal warriors into space marines was more dramatic on Baal than anywhere else in the galaxy. The radiation-adapted genetics of the blood provided an ideal foundation for the gene seed implantation process, but it also amplified the changes in ways that had not been anticipated. Neophytes who underwent the transformation showed not just the standard enhancements, but developed an almost supernatural grace and beauty that matched their Primarch's appearance. The early campaigns showcased abilities that even veteran Imperial forces found remarkable. The Blood Angels displayed a coordination in aerial combat that had never been achieved by any other legion. Sanguinius could communicate with his sons through some form of psychic link that allowed for tactical adjustments in real time, making their assault formations devastatingly effective against any opponent. The Spear of Telesto became as much a symbol of the Legion as Sanguinius himself. This ancient weapon, discovered in the deepest vaults of the great cathedral, was a master-crafted force weapon that seemed to have been waiting for the angel to claim it. When he wielded it in combat, the spear became an extension of his will, cutting through even the heaviest armor with contemptuous ease, while channeling his psychic power into devastating energy discharges. Combat doctrine evolved rapidly as the Blood Angels gained experience in different types of warfare. Unlike other legions that specialized in particular forms of combat, the Blood Angels proved adaptable to any situation. They could fight as disciplined line infantry when the situation demanded, shift to lightning-fast assault tactics when breakthrough was required, or engage in brutal close combat when the enemy needed to be completely destroyed. The inspiration Sanguinius provided to mortal soldiers became legendary throughout the growing Imperium. Imperial Guard regiments specifically requested deployment alongside the Blood Angels, not just for their combat effectiveness, but for the morale boost that came from fighting near the Angel. His presence on a battlefield could turn a desperate last stand into a glorious victory, simply through the courage he inspired in those around him. But it was the leadership he displayed during the cleansing of Cygnus that truly established his reputation throughout the galaxy. The system had been corrupted by a chaos cult that had summoned daemons to defend their worlds, creating a threat that required both tactical brilliance and spiritual purity to overcome. Sanguinius led from the front in every engagement, his wings carrying him into the thickest fighting, while his spear carved through demonic entities that could shrug off conventional weapons. Other legions began to whisper of the Blood Angels' ferocity in combat, noting a savagery that seemed at odds with their noble appearance. This was the red thirst manifesting on the battlefield, transforming disciplined space marines into berserkers who showed no mercy to their enemies. The whispers were not entirely critical. Many Imperial commanders appreciated having allies who would fight to the death without hesitation, but there were concerns about the implications of such bloodlust. The perfect coordination between the Blood Angels and their Primarch created tactical possibilities that other legions could only dream of achieving. Sanguinius could assess a battlefield from the air, while simultaneously coordinating ground movements through his psychic link with his sons. This allowed for complex multi-phase operations that would have been impossible without such intimate communication between commander and troops. A savagery that seemed at odds with their noble appearance began to worry some Imperial observers, particularly those from other legions who had fought alongside the Blood Angels in joint operations. The transformation that occurred when blood was spilled was too dramatic to ignore. Space Marines who had been discussing philosophy and art moments before a battle would become howling killers once combat began, their eyes taking on a red tinge that suggested something fundamental had changed in their brain chemistry. Horus himself took notice of his perfect brother during the Great Crusade, where Sanguinius commanded the aerial assault that broke the Orc defenses and allowed the final ground assault to succeed. The soon-to-be War Master recognized not just tactical brilliance, but a charismatic presence that could inspire loyalty from any human who encountered him. This recognition would prove crucial in the years to come, as Horus began to consider which of his brothers might support his own ambitions. The bond between Sanguinius and Horus, developed during these early campaigns, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Both Primarchs shared a gift for inspiring devotion in their followers, and both understood the burden of command in ways that some of their more solitary brothers did not. They fought together in dozens of campaigns, their legions developing complementary tactics that made them devastatingly effective when deployed as a combined force. Yet even in these moments of triumph, Sanguinius was haunted by visions of the future that grew clearer with each passing year. He began to see not just his own death, but the context surrounding it, the great civil war that would tear the Imperium apart and set brother against brother. In his prophetic dreams, he watched Horus's face transform from beloved sibling to corrupted monster, and felt his own spear piercing hearts he loved more than his own life. The Blood Angels Legion reached its zenith during the middle years of the Great Crusade, when the Imperium's expansion seemed unstoppable, and the dream of human unity appeared within reach. At full strength, the Legion numbered over 120,000 Space Marines, each one a work of art as much as a weapon of war. Their crimson armor gleamed like fresh blood in the light of alien suns, and their perfect formations moved across battlefields with a grace that made even veteran commanders pause in admiration. Sanguinius had become more than just the Emperor's favorite son. Among the common people of the Imperium, he was viewed as something approaching a living saint. His image appeared in countless works of art, from massive frescoes decorating cathedral walls to small icons carried by Imperial Guard soldiers into battle. The angel represented everything noble about humanity's expansion among the stars, proof that even in a galaxy filled with horrors, beauty and honor could still triumph. The cultural renaissance that followed Blood Angels' victories became a trademark of their campaigns. Where other legions left behind compliant worlds that functioned efficiently but showed little innovation, Worlds touched by the angels' presence experienced explosions of artistic and intellectual achievement. Universities were established, great libraries constructed, and artisan guilds flourished under the protection of warriors who understood that civilization meant more than just military conquest. This approach to conquest and compliance set the Blood Angels apart from their brother legions in ways that went beyond mere tactical doctrine. Sanguinius believed that the Great Crusade was not just about reuniting scattered human colonies, but about elevating humanity to its full potential. His warriors were trained not just in weapons and tactics, but in diplomacy, philosophy, and the appreciation of beauty in all its forms. The integration of art and warfare reached its pinnacle in the Legion's ceremonial practices. Blood Angels' initiation rituals combined ancient Baal traditions with Imperial ceremony, creating spectacles that inspired awe in witnesses while binding new recruits to their brothers through bonds that transcended mere military discipline. The Red Grail became the central symbol of these ceremonies, a crystalline chalice said to contain a single drop of Sanguinius's own blood mixed with wine from Terra's finest vineyards. Master craftsmen from across the galaxy competed for the honor of creating weapons and armor for the Blood Angels, knowing that their work would be appreciated by warriors who understood the difference between mere functionality and true artistry. The Legion's armory contained masterworked weapons that were as beautiful as they were deadly, each one inscribed with verses from the Angels' own poetry and decorated with imagery that told the story of the warrior who would wield it. The perfect integration of nobility and warfare that Sanguinius achieved became a template that other Primarchs attempted to emulate, though none succeeded in matching the natural grace with which the angel balanced these seemingly contradictory aspects of human nature. His warriors could compose music that moved listeners to tears, then fight with a fury that would make berserkers seem restrained by comparison. Sanguinius himself stood as the ultimate expression of this duality. In council chambers, he spoke with wisdom that impressed even Robiut Guilliman, his strategic insights revealing a mind that could grasp the implications of decisions across centuries rather than mere decades. On the battlefield, he fought with a skill that made him the equal of any of his brothers. His combination of aerial mobility and close combat prowess, creating tactical advantages that no other Primarch could replicate. The joy he brought to conquered worlds was unprecedented in the annals of Imperial compliance actions. Populations that had resisted other legions for years would surrender within days of the Angels' arrival, not from fear, but from genuine recognition that their lives would improve under Imperial rule. Children born on worlds liberated by the Blood Angels were named after the Primarch with such frequency that Imperial administrators had to establish new naming conventions to avoid confusion. Yet beneath this golden facade, the curse that had first manifested on Baal continued to strengthen and evolve. The Red Thirst was no longer confined to battlefield situations, but had become a constant presence in the minds of all Blood Angels. Even during peaceful moments, they found themselves drawn to the sight and scent of blood with an intensity that required constant vigilance to control. Sanguinius spent countless hours in meditation, seeking ways to understand and contain the genetic flaw that plagued his sons. His prophetic visions had grown more frequent and more detailed, showing him not just his own death, but the long-term consequences of the curse he carried. He saw his legion 10,000 years in the future, still struggling with the hunger he had unknowingly passed to them. still fighting to maintain their nobility despite the beast that lurked within their souls. The careful concealment of the legion's growing instability required coordination between Sanguinius and his most trusted captains. Reports to the Emperor and other Primarchs were carefully crafted to emphasize the Blood Angels' combat effectiveness, while minimizing references to the methods they used to achieve victory. Battle footage was edited to remove the most disturbing examples of the Red Thirst manifesting during combat operations. Captain Azka Elon, who would later become the first chapter master of the Blood Angels, proved instrumental in managing the Legion's public image while developing training techniques that helped Space Marines maintain control over their bloodlust. His innovations in mental discipline and meditation practices became essential components of Blood Angels' education, teaching warriors to channel their hunger into focused aggression rather than mindless savagery. The Sanguinary Guard, Sanguinius's personal bodyguard and honor guard, represented the pinnacle of what the Blood Angels could achieve when the Red Thirst was properly controlled and directed. These elite warriors had learned to embrace their hunger without being consumed by it, transforming what should have been a weakness into a source of supernatural focus and determination. They moved through combat zones like angels of death, their every action perfectly coordinated and devastatingly effective. Private anguish over the floor began to consume more and more of Sanguinius's thoughts. As he watched his sons struggle with impulses they could not fully understand or control, the angel carried the knowledge that he was responsible for their suffering, that his own genetic structure was the source of a curse that would plague them for eternity. This guilt created a melancholy that even his closest advisors began to notice, though none dared to question their Primarch directly. Prophetic visions had become so frequent and detailed that Sanguinius could no longer dismiss them as mere dreams or hallucinations brought on by stress. He saw the great betrayal approaching like a storm front, watched his beloved brother Horus fall to corruption, and felt his own death approaching with the inevitability of a tide. Most disturbing of all, he began to understand that his death would not end the curse, but would instead make it permanent, binding his sons to their bloodlust for all eternity. The growing sense of impending doom created a desperate urgency in everything the angel did. He pushed himself and his legion harder than ever before, seeking to accomplish as much as possible while time remained. New worlds were brought into compliance at an unprecedented rate, but the cost was becoming evident in the increasing frequency of incidents where Blood Angels lost control during combat operations. A choice between honor and survival was approaching, though the full implications would not become clear until the heresy began. Sanguinius knew through his visions that he could avoid his prophesied death by warning the Emperor of Horus's trap, but he also understood that doing so would condemn humanity to defeat. The knowledge ate at him like acid, creating a profound sadness that his closest companions began to recognize as something beyond mere melancholy. Yet even as darkness gathered at the edges of paradise, the Blood Angels continued to serve as symbols of everything noble about the Great Crusade. Their victories inspired hope across the galaxy. Their cultural achievements elevated human civilization to new heights, and their Primarch remained beloved by all who encountered him. The foundation had been laid for both the Legion's greatest triumph and its most terrible tragedy, though none save Sanguinius himself understood how closely linked these two fates would prove to be. The bonds that formed between Sanguinius and his brother Primarchs during the height of the Great Crusade reflected the angels' unique ability to find common ground with personalities that often clashed violently with one another. Where many of the Emperor's sons viewed their siblings as rivals or tools to be used, Sanguinius approached each relationship with genuine affection and respect that transcended mere political alliance. His friendship with Horus developed naturally from their shared understanding of leadership's burdens. Both Primarchs possessed the rare gift of inspiring absolute loyalty in their followers, and both recognized the weight of responsibility that came with such devotion. They spent countless hours in private conversation, discussing not just military strategy, but the philosophical implications of the crusade they were waging. Horus found in Sanguinius a brother who could appreciate both the glory and the cost of their father's vision. The War Master often sought the angels' counsel when dealing with particularly difficult compliance actions or when managing disputes between other Primarchs. Sanguinius possessed a diplomatic grace that could diffuse tensions that might otherwise escalate into open conflict. His interventions prevented several incidents that could have permanently damaged relationships within the Primarch Brotherhood, most notably the growing friction between Perturabo and Rogel Dawn over siege warfare doctrine. Robert Guillermin discovered in Sanguinius a kindred spirit who understood that conquest was merely the first step in building a lasting civilization. Their collaborations on post-compliance world development created some of the most successful Imperial colonies of the era. The Ultramarines' systematic approach to administration, combined with the Blood Angels' cultural sensitivity, produced thriving worlds that served as models for the rest of the Imperium. The theoretical frameworks they developed together influenced Imperial policy for decades. Guillermin's practical mind provided structure for Sanguinius's more intuitive understanding of human nature, while the Angels' insights into cultural preservation helped the Ultramarines avoid some of the resistance that other legions faced when implementing new governmental systems. Their joint reports to the Emperor became required reading for newly promoted Imperial commanders. Jagatai Khan found unexpected common ground with the Angel through their shared appreciation of speed and mobility in warfare. Though their approaches differed dramatically, both Primarchs understood that victory often belonged to those who could strike where their enemies least expected. The White Scar's hit-and-run tactics complemented the Blood Angels' aerial assault capabilities, creating combined operations that devastated enemies before they could mount effective responses. Their philosophical discussions revealed deeper similarities beneath surface differences. Both valued individual excellence while maintaining unshakable loyalty to the Imperium's cause. Khan's fierce independence resonated with Sanguinius's own struggles to balance personal desires with duty, and the Angel's aesthetic sensibilities appealed to the Khan's appreciation of beauty in motion and combat. Rogel Dawn's relationship with Sanguinius demonstrated how different temperaments could create mutual respect rather than conflict. The Imperial Fists as Primarch admired the Angel's unwavering moral compass, while Sanguinius valued Dawn's absolute reliability and honesty. When they worked together on fortification projects, Dawn's engineering expertise merged with Sanguinius's understanding of how architectural beauty could inspire defenders to fight beyond their normal capabilities. The defensive positions they created together became legendary throughout the Imperium. Fortress worlds designed with both functionality and aesthetic appeal proved more effective at maintaining morale during long sieges while providing superior defensive capabilities. These collaborations would prove prophetic, as many of these fortifications would later serve as crucial strongholds during the dark years of the heresy. The triumvirate of Imperium Secundus represented perhaps the most significant political alliance of the Great Crusade's later years. Sanguinius, Guilliman, and Lionel Johnson formed a partnership that could have reshaped the entire structure of imperial governance if circumstances had been different. Each brought unique strengths to the alliance, while their combined influence rivaled even the War Master's authority in certain regions of the galaxy. This triumvirate emerged from practical necessity rather than political ambition. As the Great Crusade expanded beyond the point where central coordination from Terra could manage every detail, regional autonomy became essential for maintaining the pace of expansion. The three Primarchs recognized that their combined forces could secure entire sectors more effectively than scattered individual operations. The success of their joint campaigns attracted attention throughout the imperial hierarchy. Military theorists studied their coordination methods, while political observers noted how effectively they managed to divide responsibilities without creating destructive competition. Their example inspired other Primarchs to attempt similar alliances, though none achieved the same level of seamless cooperation. Diplomatic missions became another arena where Sanguinius's influence spread throughout the growing Imperium. His presence at negotiations could transform hostile alien empires into willing imperial protectorates, not through threats or bribery, but through genuine demonstration of humanity's potential for nobility. Several major Xenos species agreed to peaceful integration specifically because they trusted the Angel's word that they would be treated with dignity under imperial rule. The cultural impact of these diplomatic successes extended far beyond simple territorial expansion. Human populations that had lived under alien rule for generations found renewed pride in their heritage when they witnessed Sanguinius negotiating as an equal with beings who had previously treated humanity as inferior. The psychological effect of seeing their species represented by such a magnificent figure could not be measured in mere statistics. Peacemaking between human factions proved equally important as the Imperium encountered worlds where civil wars had raged for centuries. Sanguinius possessed an intuitive understanding of how to address the underlying causes of conflict, rather than simply imposing imperial authority through force. His interventions often resulted in former enemies working together to build stronger societies than either had achieved independently. The influence that spread through Legion cultures galaxy-wide reflected the respect that other Primarchs held for the Angel's methods. Elements of Blood Angel's doctrine began appearing in training manuals throughout the Astartes legions, particularly regarding the integration of aesthetic education with military preparation. The concept that warriors should appreciate beauty as well as master destruction gained acceptance even among the most pragmatic legion commanders. Several legions established cultural exchange programs with the Blood Angels, sending officers to study on BAAA while hosting Blood Angels specialists in return. These programs created networks of understanding that transcended individual legion loyalties, fostering a sense of shared purpose that strengthened the entire Astartes project. The friendships formed through these exchanges would prove crucial during the chaos that followed the heresy's outbreak. The balance between nobility and pragmatism that Sanguinius achieved became a template for imperial governance that outlasted the crusade itself. His demonstration that effective military action could coexist with cultural sensitivity provided a model for planetary governors and military commanders throughout the expanding Imperium. Worlds brought into compliance using his methods showed lower rates of rebellion and higher levels of productive integration. Protection of civilian populations during military operations became a hallmark of campaigns where Sanguinius held command. Unlike some of his brothers who viewed non-combatant casualties as acceptable costs of war, the Angel insisted that protecting innocent lives was essential to the Crusade's moral legitimacy. This approach sometimes resulted in longer campaigns, but created lasting loyalty that paid dividends for generations. Integration of conquered worlds reflected Sanguinius's understanding that true victory required winning hearts and minds, rather than simply destroying resistance. His post-compliance policies emphasized preserving valuable cultural traditions while gradually introducing imperial systems that enhanced rather than replaced existing social structures. This approach created some of the most stable and prosperous worlds in the entire Imperium. The Blood Angels served as living examples of imperial ideals wherever they were deployed. Their combination of martial prowess and cultural sophistication demonstrated that humanity's expansion among the stars represented genuine progress rather than mere conquest. Civilian populations that encountered the Legion often became enthusiastic supporters of imperial rule, spreading positive reports that eased compliance efforts in neighboring systems. But whispers reached him of a growing rebellion that would shatter everything he had worked to build. Reports filtered in through intelligence networks of something stirring among the traitor legions, though the full scope of the conspiracy remained hidden. Sanguinius felt the approaching storm through his prophetic visions, watching helplessly as the brotherhood he cherished moved inexorably toward destruction. His beloved brother Horus was falling to corruption that no amount of love or loyalty could prevent. The angel's visions showed him glimpses of the War Master's transformation, each revelation more horrifying than the last. Yet even as he watched his closest brother become something monstrous, Sanguinius could not bring himself to believe that the bonds they had forged could ever be completely severed. A choice that would tear the galaxy apart was approaching with the inevitability of fate itself. The networks of friendship and alliance that Sanguinius had worked so hard to build would soon become weapons used against the very Imperium they had been created to serve. The angel felt the weight of approaching tragedy with every prophetic vision, knowing that his spreading influence had created connections that would make the coming betrayal all the more devastating. The first fragments of disturbing intelligence reached Sanguinius through channels that bypassed normal Imperial communication networks. Astropathic messages arrived encoded in ciphers that only the Primarchs knew, carrying reports that seemed too terrible to believe. The sons of Horus had bombarded their own positions on Istvan III, killing thousands of loyalist space marines in what appeared to be a catastrophic targeting error. But as more details emerged, the horrible truth became undeniable. Sanguinius experienced the revelation through one of his prophetic visions before any official confirmation arrived. He saw Horus standing on the command deck of the Vengeful Spirit, his face transformed by something that was no longer entirely human. The corruption had already taken hold, twisting his brother's noble features into something that inspired fear rather than admiration. In the vision, Horus's eyes held depths of malice that the angel had never seen in any living being. The horror of witnessing his beloved brother's transformation went beyond simple shock or grief. Sanguinius felt a profound sense of personal failure, as if his love and friendship should somehow have been strong enough to prevent this catastrophe. The bonds they had forged over decades of shared struggle seemed meaningless in the face of whatever dark forces had claimed the War Master's soul. Intelligence reports from the Istvan system painted a picture of betrayal so complete and systematic that it could only have been planned for years. Entire companies of loyalist space marines had been isolated and marked for death, while their traitorous brothers prepared for the massacre. The precision of the operation suggested that Horus had not fallen to sudden madness, but had been carefully orchestrating this rebellion while maintaining the facade of loyalty. The impossible choice that faced Sanguinius tore at his very essence. Personal loyalty to Horus warred with absolute devotion to the Emperor, creating a conflict that seemed to have no acceptable resolution. How could he take up arms against the brother who had stood beside him through countless battles? Yet how could he ignore evidence of treason that threatened everything the Great Crusade had achieved? The drop site massacre at Istvan shattered any remaining illusions about the scope of the rebellion. Reports arrived through desperate astropathic transmissions from surviving loyalists, describing a coordinated assault that had decimated 3 entire legions. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard had been lured into a trap so perfectly executed that it could only have succeeded with the cooperation of other Primarchs who were supposed to be loyal. The implications of such widespread treachery sent shockwaves through every loyal force in the galaxy. If half the Primarchs could turn against their father, then nowhere was safe and no one could be trusted completely. The unity that had defined the Great Crusade's success crumbled overnight, replaced by suspicion and uncertainty that paralyzed decision-making throughout the Imperial hierarchy. Formation of the Loyalist coalition required Sanguinius to shoulder responsibilities that should have been shared among all the faithful Primarchs. With the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra and uncertainty about which forces remained loyal, the Angel found himself coordinating resistance efforts across multiple sectors while struggling to maintain the morale of his own legion. The weight of leadership during this crisis revealed aspects of Sanguinius's character that had remained hidden during the Crusade's glory years. His natural diplomacy evolved into strategic ruthlessness when necessary, while his aesthetic sensibilities were tempered by grim practicality. The Angel, who had once been content to serve as inspiration, became a war leader capable of making decisions that would determine the Imperium's survival. Coordination between scattered loyalist forces proved nearly impossible, with traditional communication methods compromised. Traitor agents had infiltrated Imperial institutions so thoroughly that every message risked interception, while warp storms of unusual intensity disrupted astropathic contact across vast regions of space. Sanguinius was forced to rely increasingly on his prophetic visions to anticipate enemy movements and coordinate defensive strategies. The red thirst that had plagued the Blood Angels throughout their history began manifesting with unprecedented intensity as the stress of civil war pushed the Legion beyond its normal limits. Warriors who had successfully managed their bloodlust for decades found themselves struggling with urges that threatened to overwhelm their discipline. The careful balance that Sanguinius had maintained within his legion started to collapse under the pressure of constant combat and betrayal. Combat situations that should have been routine became bloodbaths as Blood Angels lost control, during critical moments. Prisoners who should have been interrogated for intelligence were torn apart in feeding frenzies that their battle brothers could barely contain. The tactical flexibility that had made the Legion so effective began to erode as commanders hesitated to deploy units whose behavior had become unpredictable. Worsening manifestations of the genetic flaw created a cascade of secondary problems that threatened the Legion's effectiveness. Medical staff struggled to treat warriors whose blood chemistry had been altered by constant exposure to combat stress and psychological trauma. Equipment designed for disciplined space marines proved inadequate for managing soldiers who might suddenly develop superhuman strength and resistance to restraint. The first instances of what would later be called the Black Rage appeared during the Battle of Cygnus Prime, though their significance was not immediately understood. Several Blood Angels began experiencing vivid hallucinations that seemed to place them in different times and locations, fighting battles that bore no relationship to their current circumstances. These affected warriors fought with berserker fury that surpassed even the Red Thirst's influence, but they were clearly reliving experiences that belonged to someone else. Analysis of these incidents revealed disturbing patterns that suggested a deeper connection between the affected warriors and their Primarch than anyone had previously realized. The hallucinations consistently featured scenarios involving Sanguinius himself, as if the warriors were somehow accessing their Gene Father's memories or experiencing his emotions secondhand. Medical personnel struggled to understand how such psychic connections could exist without conscious control from either the Primarch or his sons. Growing darkness throughout the galaxy created an atmosphere of despair that affected even the most stalwart Imperial defenders. News of each fresh betrayal eroded confidence in the Imperium's ultimate victory, while the seemingly endless succession of defeats made it difficult to maintain hope for the future. Sanguinius found himself serving not just as a military commander, but as a spiritual leader for forces that desperately needed reasons to continue fighting. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra left a void in Imperial leadership that no single figure could fill, yet Sanguinius found himself expected to provide the inspiration and guidance that had previously come from the Master of Mankind himself. The Angel's natural charisma and moral authority made him a focal point for loyalist resistance, but the burden of such expectations threatened to overwhelm even his superhuman capabilities. Weight of expectation from desperate Imperial forces created pressure that compounded the genetic instability already plaguing the Blood Angels. Sanguinius pushed himself and his legion beyond safe limits in an effort to provide the victories that loyalist morale desperately needed. Each success came at a higher cost in casualties and psychological damage, while failures carried implications that extended far beyond mere tactical setbacks. Imperium Secundus emerged as a necessary response to the collapse of centralized imperial authority, though the political implications troubled Sanguinius deeply. The creation of an alternative power structure felt uncomfortably close to treason, even though it was clearly intended to preserve rather than replace the Emperor's vision. The Angel's coronation as Emperor of Secundus was perhaps the most reluctant assumption of power in Imperial history. The crown he never wanted to wear became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the Great Crusade's original vision. Instead of serving his father as a dutiful son, Sanguinius found himself forced to assume the very role that should have remained unique to the Emperor. The irony was not lost on him that his loyalty to the Imperium had led him to take actions that could be interpreted as the ultimate disloyalty. The angel's visions grew darker and more certain with each passing day, showing him details of his approaching death with crystalline clarity. He could see the deck of the Vengeful Spirit, feel Horus's claws tearing through his armor, experience the moment when his wings would be ripped away and his blood would stain the cold metal beneath him. Each vision reinforced his understanding that he was walking toward a fate that no amount of preparation could change. His own death approaching seemed less significant than the realization that it would serve a purpose in the Emperor's ultimate victory. The visions showed him that his sacrifice would create the weakness in Horus's defenses that would allow their father to achieve final triumph. This knowledge brought a measure of peace, even as it filled him with sadness for the sons he would leave behind to struggle with the curse his death would make permanent. A choice between saving himself and saving all humanity was crystallizing in Sanguinius's mind as the heresy progressed toward its inevitable climax. His prophetic gifts had shown him the moment of decision that awaited him aboard the Vengeful Spirit, when he could warn the Emperor of Horus's trap and preserve his own life, or remain silent and ensure that the trap would be sprung, but ultimately fail. The weight of that future choice already pressed upon him like a physical burden, making every current decision feel like preparation for his final act of service to the Imperium he loved more than his own existence. The establishment of Imperium Secundus represented one of the most extraordinary political developments in human history. Yet it began not from ambition, but from the desperate necessity of survival. When astropathic contact with Terra ceased entirely, and the ruin storm isolated vast regions of the galaxy from Imperial coordination, Robot Guilliman made the unprecedented decision to create an alternative seat of Imperial power centered on Ultramar. The selection of Sanguinius as Emperor of Secundus was both inevitable and deeply troubling to the angel himself. Among the Primarchs available in the Ultima Segmentum, only he possessed the combination of moral authority and inspirational presence necessary to legitimize such a dramatic departure from established imperial hierarchy. Yet accepting the crown felt like betraying everything he had sworn to uphold, even though refusal would condemn billions of imperial citizens to abandonment and likely death. The coronation ceremony took place in the Temple of Correction on Macraig, a structure that had been hastily modified to accommodate the unprecedented nature of the proceedings. Ancient Terran protocols were adapted to create a ritual that honored the Emperor's authority while establishing the legal framework for Secundus governance. Sanguinius approached the altar with visible reluctance, his wings drooping as if weighted down by the enormity of what was being asked of him. When the crown was placed upon his head, witnesses reported that the angel's expression showed not triumph, but profound sorrow. He understood better than anyone present that this moment represented not the creation of something new, but the acknowledgement that the original Imperium might already be lost. His acceptance speech emphasized that Secundus existed only to preserve the Emperor's vision until such time as contact with Terra could be re-established and proper authority restored. The weight of the crown grew heavier with each decision that required Imperial approval. Every world that sought protection under Secundus' authority represented another step away from the unified human empire that the Great Crusade had sought to create. Sanguinius found himself forced to make choices that affected the lives of entire planetary populations, knowing that each decision might later be judged as overstepping his proper authority. Administrative responsibilities that should have been handled by experienced bureaucrats fell instead to a Primarch whose training had focused on warfare and inspiration rather than governance. The angel's natural intuition served him well in many situations, but the complexity of managing multiple star systems required skills that no amount of genetic enhancement could provide. He relied heavily on advisors drawn from Guilliman's extensive administrative apparatus, though final decisions remained his to make. Alliance with Guilliman and the Lion created a power structure that could have reshaped the entire galaxy if circumstances had been different. The triumvirate combined Guilliman's organizational genius, Lion L. Johnson's strategic brilliance, and Sanguinius's inspirational leadership into a force that proved remarkably effective at maintaining Imperial authority across the isolated regions under their control. The partnership revealed aspects of each Primarch's character that had remained hidden during the Great Crusade's more structured command hierarchy. Guilliman's pragmatic approach to governance complemented the Angel's more intuitive understanding of human nature, while the Lion's suspicious temperament provided a useful counterbalance to Sanguinius's tendency to trust too readily in others' good intentions. Ultramar, as a backup Imperium, demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of regional autonomy within the Imperial system. The 500 worlds had developed administrative and military capabilities that rivaled those of Terra itself, yet they lacked the spiritual authority and galactic reach that made the original Imperium more than just another stellar empire. The success of Secundus governance created uncomfortable questions about the efficiency of centralized control versus regional adaptation. Worlds under triumvirate authority often showed better economic performance and higher citizen satisfaction than comparable planets under direct Terran administration. This raised implications about imperial structure that would have profound consequences for post-heresy reorganization. Coordination of loyalist resistance across multiple fronts required strategic thinking on a scale that challenged even Primarch capabilities. The triumvirate found themselves managing not just their own forces, but attempting to coordinate with scattered loyalist elements throughout the galaxy while lacking reliable communication methods. Success often depended more on intuition and calculated risk-taking than on detailed planning. The Pharaoh's device on Sotha provided a crucial technological advantage that allowed Secundus forces to navigate the warp storms that had isolated them from the broader conflict. This ancient Xenos technology, reluctantly employed despite its alien origins, offered the only reliable means of coordinating fleet movements across the region. Its use represented the kind of pragmatic compromise that would have been unthinkable during the Crusade's purest phase. Communication networks established through the Pharaohs revealed the true scope of the galactic civil war for the first time since the heresy began. Intelligence reports painted a picture of destruction so vast that it challenged comprehension, while the systematic nature of traitor attacks suggested coordination on a level that implied chaos involvement beyond simple rebellion. The Horus Heresy had escalated far beyond what anyone had initially imagined possible. What had begun as a localized revolt by a handful of Space Marine legions had evolved into a galaxy-spanning conflict that threatened the complete destruction of human civilization. The traitor forces were not simply seeking to overthrow imperial authority, but appeared intent on remaking humanity itself according to principles that defied rational understanding. Traitor legions displayed capabilities that seemed to transcend their original limitations, suggesting enhancement through sources that loyalist forces could not match. Reports described space marines who fought with supernatural fury, weapons that violated the laws of physics, and tactical coordination that implied knowledge of loyalist plans before they were even formulated. Chaos corruption was spreading through mechanisms that imperial science could not adequately explain or counter. Entire planetary populations showed signs of mutation and madness that appeared to be contagious, while loyalist forces that engaged traitor armies sometimes returned, fundamentally changed by experiences that they could not articulate. Daemon Primarchs represented a threat category that had no precedent in imperial military doctrine. Intelligence reports described beings who retained the memories and capabilities of their former selves while possessing powers that seemed to violate fundamental principles of reality. The transformation of respected Primarchs into entities that inspired terror in their own sons created psychological warfare effects that conventional military training could not address. Civilian populations under threat faced horrors that went beyond simple conquest or occupation. Traitor forces appeared to be deliberately targeting non-combatants for reasons that had no strategic value, suggesting that inflicting suffering had become an end in itself rather than a means to achieve military objectives. The Emperor's silence from Terra created perhaps the greatest source of uncertainty for loyalist forces throughout the galaxy. Without guidance from the Master of Mankind, individual commanders were forced to make decisions based on incomplete information and personal judgment. The absence of clear direction led to conflicting strategies that sometimes resulted in loyalist forces working at cross purposes. Loyalist forces found themselves increasingly scattered and isolated as traitor advances cut supply lines and communication networks. What had begun as a coordinated defense of imperial territory devolved into hundreds of separate conflicts, each fought by commanders who had little knowledge of the broader strategic situation. Desperation began to affect decision-making at every level of the imperial hierarchy. Planetary governors authorized tactics that would have been considered war crimes during peacetime, while military commanders accepted casualties that would have been unthinkable during the Great Crusade. The degradation of imperial standards reflected the recognition that survival itself had become uncertain. The crown's weight grew heavier, with each atrocity reported from the wider galaxy. Sanguinius found himself responsible not just for governing Secundus, but for maintaining hope among populations that were beginning to believe that the Imperium itself might not survive. Every public appearance required him to project confidence that he did not always feel, while his private moments were consumed by visions of approaching doom. Word reached them that Terra itself was threatened by Horus's advancing forces, though the details remained frustratingly vague. The isolation that had necessitated Secundus' creation also prevented reliable intelligence about the war's progress in the galaxy's core regions. Sanguinius's prophetic visions provided glimpses of the siege to come, but they raised more questions than they answered about timing and tactical details. The Angel's greatest test was about to begin, though its true nature remained hidden even from his prescient abilities. The visions that had plagued him throughout the heresy were converging on a single point of crisis where personal loyalty, imperial duty, and cosmic necessity would collide in ways that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of human civilization itself. The weight of that approaching moment pressed upon him with increasing intensity as reports from Terra grew more dire, and the ruin storm showed signs of finally beginning to abate. The dissolution of Imperium Secundus came not from external pressure, but from Sanguinius's own recognition that his true duty lay elsewhere. Intelligence reports filtering through the gradually weakening windstorm painted an increasingly desperate picture of Terra's situation. The War Master's forces had begun their final advance toward humanity's birthworld, and every hour of delay meant that the Emperor faced greater odds of survival. The decision to abandon the relative safety of Ultramar required Sanguinius to confront uncomfortable truths about his own motivations. Part of him had found genuine relief in the isolation that justified remaining distant from the galaxy's core conflicts. Serving as Emperor of Secundus had allowed him to make a meaningful contribution to the war effort while avoiding the prophesied confrontation with Horus that his visions showed would end in his death. Yet his prophetic gifts would not allow him to maintain such comfortable self-deception indefinitely. The visions of Terra's siege grew more vivid and detailed with each passing day, showing him the Emperor fighting alone against overwhelming odds while his most loyal son remained safely distant. The weight of that potential betrayal became unbearable, finally forcing the angel to choose between personal survival and filial duty. Preparation for the journey to Terra revealed the true cost of the years spent in isolation. The Blood Angels' legion had grown increasingly unstable during their time in Ultramar, with the Red Thirst manifesting more frequently and with greater intensity among warriors who had been pushed beyond their normal limits by constant combat against Chaos forces. Medical assessments conducted before departure painted a troubling picture of genetic degradation that threatened the Legion's long-term viability. Apothecaries reported that nearly 30% of the surviving Blood Angels showed symptoms of psychological instability that went beyond the normal effects of prolonged warfare. Sleep cycles were disrupted by nightmares that seemed to blend personal experiences with alien memories, while waking hours were plagued by auditory hallucinations that resembled voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The race across the galaxy toward Terra required navigating hazards that had not existed during the Great Crusade's expansion phase. Warp storms of unprecedented intensity blocked traditional routes, while chaos-corrupted systems posed threats that conventional Imperial doctrine had never anticipated. Sanguinius found himself forced to order transit through regions of space where reality itself had become unreliable. Pushing the fleet beyond safe operational parameters became necessary when conventional navigation proved inadequate for reaching Terra before the siege reached its climax. The Angel authorized warp jumps using partially corrupted navigational data and accepted casualty rates that would have been unthinkable during peacetime operations. Entire squadrons were lost to warp entities that seemed to target Blood Angels' vessels specifically, as if drawn by some quality unique to the Legion's gene seed. The Blood Angels themselves began changing during the desperate journey in ways that went beyond simple combat fatigue or psychological stress. Warriors who had served with distinction for decades started displaying behavioral patterns that resembled the tribal blood cultists of ancient Baal more than disciplined space marines. The careful balance between nobility and savagery that had defined the Legion's character shifted decisively toward the latter as survival instincts overwhelmed cultural conditioning. Sanguinius pushed his sons to their absolute limits, while knowing that he was likely condemning them to a fate worse than death. His visions had shown him what would happen to the Blood Angels after his prophesied sacrifice. The Black Rage would claim them permanently, transforming his noble warriors into berserkers who would relive his final moments for the rest of their existence. Yet the alternative was abandoning the Emperor to face Horus alone, a betrayal that would damn not just the Legion, but all of humanity. The dangerous warp routes that offered the only hope of reaching Terra in time required navigation through regions where the boundary between real space and the immaterium had become dangerously thin. Ships reported encountering entities that should not have been able to exist in normal space, while sensor readings detected gravitational anomalies that defied mathematical analysis. Using partially corrupted star charts from chaos-held territories forced the fleet to rely on information that might have been deliberately falsified to lure loyalist forces into traps. Yet Sanguinius's prophetic abilities provided enough verification to identify the most reliable data, allowing the Blood Angels to avoid several obvious deceptions while accepting calculated risks on routes that conventional wisdom would have deemed suicidal. The Red Thirst reached critical levels among the Legion's rank and file, as the stress of constant warp exposure combined with irregular resupply to create conditions that pushed the gene seed floor beyond manageable parameters. Blood Angels, who had controlled their hunger for decades, found themselves unable to resist the urge to feed when casualties provided opportunities. Medical staff struggled to maintain discipline among patients whose wounds seemed to heal faster when they consumed the blood of their fallen brothers. Apothecary reports documented physiological changes that suggested the Red Thirst was evolving into something unprecedented. Standard treatments that had previously proven effective in managing the condition began failing as affected warriors developed resistance to pharmacological interventions. More disturbing still, some Blood Angels began displaying enhanced combat capabilities while under the influence of the thirst, fighting with strength and speed that exceeded normal Space Marine parameters. The gene seed degradation accelerated beyond safe parameters as the Legion pushed itself through trials that would have destroyed lesser forces entirely. Progenoid glands began producing aberrant genetic material that carried enhanced expressions of the flaws that had always plagued the Blood Angels. New recruits who received this corrupted gene seed developed the Red Thirst within days rather than years, while some showed signs of the nascent Black Rage even before completing their transformation into full Space Marines. Blood Angels grew increasingly savage in combat as their psychological conditioning eroded under the combined pressure of warp exposure and genetic instability. Warriors who had once been renowned for their discipline and tactical flexibility began exhibiting behavior patterns that resembled those of World Eater's berserkers. The difference was that Blood Angels retained their intelligence and strategic thinking even while consumed by bloodlust, making them more dangerous than simple rage-fueled killers. The Black Rage began claiming more warriors with each engagement, though its manifestations remained inconsistent and poorly understood. Affected blood angels experienced vivid hallucinations that placed them in battles they had never fought, wielding weapons they had never touched, and facing enemies they had never encountered. These episodes typically lasted until the warrior was killed or collapsed from exhaustion, but their combat effectiveness during the episodes exceeded anything in recorded Space Marine history. Sanguinius recognized the growing isolation that separated him from his sons as the genetic bond between them, strengthened in ways that brought more pain than comfort. He could feel their hunger as if it were his own, experience their rage as a constant background noise in his consciousness, and share their nightmares through psychic connections that he could not sever without destroying them completely. Prophetic visions became clearer and more terrible as the fleet approached Terra, showing the angel details of his approaching death with crystalline precision. He could see the exact moment when Horus's claws would pierce his heart, feel the agony of his wings being torn away, and experience the cold touch of death spreading through his body. More painful still, he witnessed the psychic scream that his death would send through the warp, permanently afflicting every blood angel with the black rage that would make them relive his final moments forever. Something fundamental was changing in the angels' sons that might be worse than death itself. The noble warriors who had once served as symbols of imperial virtue were transforming into creatures whose loyalty remained absolute, but whose methods had become indistinguishable from those of chaos cultists. They fought for the Emperor's glory, but they did so with teeth and claws rather than bolters and chainswords, drinking the blood of their enemies and howling prayers that sounded more like curses. The knowledge that his approaching sacrifice would make these changes permanent weighed on Sanguinius more heavily than any physical burden he had ever carried. Yet Terra's need outweighed all other considerations, including his paternal love for the warriors who called him father. The Emperor faced odds that no single being could overcome alone, and the visions had shown clearly that only the angel's sacrifice could create the weakness in Horus's defenses that would allow ultimate victory. The approaching climax of the heresy demanded choices that went beyond simple courage or duty into realms of sacrifice that challenged the very foundations of what it meant to be human. Sanguinius understood that his death would serve a purpose greater than his own existence, but that knowledge provided no comfort as he watched his sons transform into the very monsters that the Great Crusade had sought to eliminate from the galaxy. The sight that greeted Sanguinius as his fleet emerged from the warp at Terra's edge defied every catastrophic vision his prophetic gifts had shown him. The birthworld of humanity burned under an assault so vast and coordinated that it challenged comprehension. Orbital platforms that had protected Terra for millennia drifted as gutted hulks among debris fields that stretched for millions of kilometers. The planet's surface glowed with the fires of 1,000 battlefields, while the space around it swarmed with traitor vessels in numbers that seemed impossible. The Imperial Palace, that monument to human achievement that had stood inviolate since the Emperor's conquest of Terra, showed scars that spoke of assaults beyond imagination. Massive breaches had been torn in walls that were supposed to be impregnable, while entire sections of the structure had been reduced to rubble by weapons that violated the fundamental laws of physics. Yet somehow, impossibly, the palace still stood, its remaining spires reaching toward the void, like defiant fingers raised against the darkness. The state of Terra's defenders revealed the true cost of the siege in ways that casualty reports could never convey. Imperial Guard regiments that had once been the pride of their homeworlds had been reduced to ragged survivors who fought with desperation rather than discipline. Space Marine formations from loyalist legions showed gaps in their ranks that spoke of losses so severe they threatened organizational coherence. Even the vaunted Custodian Guard, the Emperor's personal protectors, had been bloodied in ways that should have been impossible. Arrival of the Blood Angels fleet provided a psychological boost to Terra's defenders that went far beyond mere tactical reinforcement. The sight of Sanguinius's crimson-armored warriors descending from the sky like avenging angels gave new hope to soldiers who had begun to believe that defeat was inevitable. Citizens who had cowered in ruins emerged to cheer the angels' arrival, their faces lighting with joy that seemed impossible given their circumstances. The reunion between the Emperor and his favored son took place in the throne room of the Imperial Palace, beneath murals that depicted the golden age of human expansion among the stars. The master of mankind appeared diminished by the siege's toll, his features showing signs of strain that would have been unthinkable during the Great Crusade's glory years. Yet his presence still radiated power that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. Their conversation lasted only minutes, yet it contained volumes of meaning that transcended mere words. The Emperor's relief at seeing his beloved son was matched by Sanguinius's anguish at witnessing his father's condition. Years of separation had created distance between them, but the bonds forged in the laboratories beneath Terra remained stronger than any circumstance could break. The angel's confession of his prophetic knowledge created a moment of profound understanding between father and son. Sanguinius revealed that he had seen his own death aboard the Vengeful Spirit, witnessed the moment when Horus's claws would pierce his hearts, and understood that this sacrifice would be necessary for the Emperor's ultimate victory. The Emperor's response conveyed both sorrow at the price that would be demanded and acceptance of the necessity that cosmic forces had decreed. Assignment to defend the ultimate gate represented both honor and burden in equal measure. This position was the final barrier between Horus's forces and the Emperor himself, the point where the palace's last defenses would make their stand against overwhelming odds. Command of this critical sector demonstrated the Emperor's absolute trust in his son, while placing the angel at the precise location where his prophetic visions suggested his death would have the greatest impact. The weight of defending humanity's last hope settled upon Sanguinius like a physical burden that compressed his very soul. Every decision he made would affect not just the immediate battle, but the future of human civilization itself. The soldiers under his command looked to him for inspiration and guidance, yet he could not share the knowledge that his visions had shown him about the siege's ultimate cost. The defensive preparations revealed the true scope of the crisis facing Terra's loyalists. Ammunition stocks had been depleted to critical levels, while medical supplies were so scarce that wounded soldiers often received no treatment beyond basic field care. Food distribution had broken down in many sectors, forcing civilian populations to survive on emergency rations that provided barely adequate nutrition. The siege's intensity exceeded anything in recorded military history, with traitor forces maintaining pressure that never allowed defenders a moment's respite. Chaos Space Marines attacked in waves that seemed designed more to inflict suffering than to achieve tactical objectives, while Daemon engines spewed corruption that transformed the very ground they touched into alien landscapes that hurt to look upon. Traitor forces displayed capabilities that defied conventional military analysis, suggesting enhancement through sources that loyalist intelligence could not identify or counter. Warriors who should have been killed by wounds that would destroy normal space marines continued fighting with undiminished effectiveness, while weapons that violated physical laws created effects that no amount of training could prepare defenders to face. Daemon engines and Chaos Titans represented threat categories that Imperial doctrine had never anticipated confronting. These constructs combined technological sophistication with supernatural abilities in ways that rendered traditional anti-armor tactics largely ineffective. Worse still, their very presence seemed to corrupt the defenders who fought against them, spreading madness and despair through proximity effects that no amount of faith could completely resist. Sanguinius led from the front in every engagement, his presence providing inspiration that transformed desperate last stands into heroic victories against impossible odds. His golden hair streamed behind him as he soared above battlefields that resembled visions of hell, the spear of Telesto, carving through enemies that would have required entire squads to defeat through conventional means. The angel's combat effectiveness during the siege surpassed even his legendary prowess during the Great Crusade. Desperation had unlocked aspects of his abilities that had remained dormant during peacetime, while his prophetic knowledge allowed him to anticipate enemy movements with supernatural precision. He fought like a being possessed by divine fury, his every action perfectly calculated to achieve maximum impact against the forces arrayed against humanity. Blood angels unleashed berserker fury that transformed them from disciplined space marines into creatures of pure destruction. The careful balance their Primarch had maintained between nobility and savagery collapsed completely under the siege's pressure, revealing the true extent of the curse that had always lurked within their gene seed. They fought with teeth and claws as much as with weapons, drinking the blood of fallen enemies while howling battle cries that sounded more like the calls of hunting beasts. Kabanda's personal vendetta against Sanguinius added a supernatural dimension to the siege that went beyond mere military conflict. This greater daemon of Khorne had harbored hatred for the angel since their first encounter during the Cygnus campaign, and its presence on Terra guaranteed that the Blood Angels would face challenges that transcended physical warfare. The daemon's attacks on Sanguinius were precisely calculated to exploit the angel's greatest vulnerabilities. Rather than relying on brute force alone, Kabanda sought to break his opponent's spirit by forcing him to witness the corruption of his sons. Each blood angel who fell to the Black Rage during combat represented a personal victory for the daemon, proof that even the most noble of the Primarchs carried seeds of destruction within his very essence. Growing exhaustion began to affect even Sanguinius's superhuman endurance as the siege entered its final phase. Days of constant combat without rest had pushed him beyond the limits that normal space marines could endure, while the psychic strain of maintaining inspiration among his followers demanded energy that his body could not indefinitely provide. The visions of his approaching death had become so clear and detailed that they interfered with his ability to focus on immediate tactical concerns. He could see the deck of the Vengeful Spirit with perfect clarity, feel the cold metal beneath his feet, and experience the moment when Horus's blow would end his existence. The knowledge of his fate created a strange detachment from current events, as if he were already watching his final battle from some distant perspective. Clear sight of his approaching death brought unexpected peace to the angel's troubled soul. The uncertainty that had plagued him throughout the heresy finally ended as he understood the exact nature of the choice that awaited him. He could warn the Emperor about Horus's trap and preserve his own life, or remain silent and ensure that the trap would be sprung, but ultimately fail to achieve its intended purpose. The choice between personal survival and humanity's salvation represented the ultimate test of everything Sanguinius had claimed to believe throughout his existence. His prophetic visions had shown him that warning the Emperor would result in a different approach to the final confrontation, one that would spare the angel's life but leave Horus's defenses intact and guarantee the War Master's victory. Deciding to sacrifice himself for ultimate victory required Sanguinius to accept that his death would condemn his legion to eternal suffering. The black rage that would result from his sacrifice would afflict every blood angel for all time, transforming them into creatures who would relive his final moments forever. Yet the alternative was the complete destruction of humanity itself, a price too terrible to contemplate, regardless of personal cost. The weight of condemning his legion to this curse created anguish that surpassed even the prospect of his own death. These were his sons, warriors who had followed him across the galaxy and trusted him to lead them to glory rather than damnation. Yet cosmic necessity demanded sacrifices that went beyond personal relationships or familial bonds. Final preparations for the ultimate battle involved making peace with choices that would echo through eternity. Sanguinius spent his last hours on Terra in meditation, seeking to achieve spiritual readiness for a sacrifice that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of human civilization itself. The knowledge that his death would serve a purpose greater than his own existence provided some comfort, though it could not eliminate the sadness he felt for the sons he would leave behind to struggle with the consequences of his decision. The moment when Horus lowered the Vengeful Spirit's void shields marked the beginning of the end for both sides of the galactic civil war. This action, inexplicable by conventional military logic, created an opportunity that the Emperor could not ignore despite the obvious trap it represented. The War Master's flagship, which had been untouchable behind layers of defensive energy fields, suddenly became vulnerable to direct assault for the first time since the siege began. Intelligence analysis of this development produced conflicting theories about Horus's motivations. Some advisors suggested that the traitor forces had suffered damage that made maintaining the shields impossible, while others proposed that internal discord among the Chaos Space Marine legions had forced the War Master's hand. The Emperor's closest counselors recommended caution, arguing that such an obvious opening could only be intended to lure loyalist leaders into a carefully prepared ambush. Yet Sanguinius knew through his prophetic visions that this moment represented the fulcrum upon which the entire war would turn. His supernatural insight revealed the truth that conventional analysis could not grasp. Horus had not lowered his shields from weakness or desperation, but from supreme confidence in his ability to destroy the Emperor in single combat. The War Master believed that victory was assured once he could face his father without interference from loyalist forces. The Emperor's decision to teleport aboard the enemy flagship demonstrated either supreme confidence or desperate gamble, depending on one's perspective. The Master of Mankind had concluded that conventional assault methods could not overcome the traitor advantages in time to prevent Terra's complete destruction. Only by striking directly at the enemy's leadership could the loyalist cause achieve victory before their remaining forces were overwhelmed entirely. Preparation for the teleportation assault required coordination between multiple Imperial agencies whose normal procedures had been disrupted by years of siege warfare. The Adeptus Mechanicus provided targeting data based on fragmentary intelligence about the Vengeful Spirit's internal structure, while the Custodian Guard selected warriors whose loyalty and combat effectiveness were beyond question. Sanguinius volunteered to accompany his father without hesitation, though he knew from his visions that this decision would lead directly to his death. The alternative was allowing the Emperor to face Horus alone, a scenario that his prophetic gifts had shown would result in failure and the complete destruction of humanity. The angel's choice represented not bravery, but acceptance of cosmic necessity that transcended personal survival. The technological challenges of teleporting through the warp storms surrounding Terra stretched Imperial capabilities to their absolute limits. The psychic interference generated by chaos forces made precise targeting nearly impossible, while the sheer distance involved pushed teleportation equipment beyond its design parameters. Success required not just technical expertise, but supernatural intervention that defied rational explanation. The teleportation scatter that separated the assault force was not accidental, but represented deliberate manipulation by chaos entities that sought to isolate the Emperor's champions and defeat them individually. The pattern of displacement showed clear evidence of intelligent design, with key personnel placed in positions that would maximize their vulnerability while minimizing their ability to support one another. Finding himself alone with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit fulfilled the most terrible of Sanguinius's prophetic visions, while confirming that cosmic forces beyond mortal understanding were orchestrating events according to some vast design. The angel's isolation was not mere tactical misfortune, but spiritual necessity, the final test that would determine whether love or corruption would ultimately triumph in the struggle for humanity's soul. The Vengeful Spirit's interior had been transformed by years of chaos corruption into something that barely resembled the magnificent vessel it had once been. Passages that had once gleamed with imperial grandeur now pulsed with organic growths that seemed to breathe and whisper in languages that predated human civilization. The ship's machine spirit had been replaced by something alien and malevolent that responded to thoughts rather than commands. Navigation through the corrupted corridors required more than just physical courage, as the very environment seemed designed to assault sanity and moral certainty. Walls displayed images that violated natural law, while the air itself carried scents that triggered memories of events that had never happened. Sanguinius pressed forward through this nightmare landscape, guided only by his prophetic knowledge of where his destiny awaited. The throne room where Horus held court represented the ultimate corruption of everything the Great Crusade had sought to achieve. Ancient Terran artifacts had been defiled with chaos symbols, while banners that had once proclaimed imperial glory now bore sigils that hurt to look upon directly. The very architecture seemed to bend reality around itself, creating spatial relationships that defied geometric possibility. Brothers' final meeting began not with violence, but with recognition that transcended the corruption that had claimed the War Master's soul. For a brief moment, Horus's features showed traces of the beloved sibling who had stood beside Sanguinius through countless campaigns during the Crusade's golden years. The angel saw in his brother's eyes a flicker of the nobility that had made him the emperor's chosen son and most trusted general. Sanguinius's attempts to reach his brother through appeals to their shared memories represented perhaps the most heartbreaking conversation in human history. The angel spoke of campaigns they had fought together, victories they had shared, and the dreams of human unity that had once inspired them both. For moments at a time, it seemed as though his words were penetrating the chaos corruption that had consumed Horus's essence. The corruption proved too deep to overcome through love or logic alone, as the dark gods had not merely influenced the War Master, but had fundamentally rewritten his spiritual essence. What remained of Horus's original personality served only to make his fall more tragic, a mockery of everything he had once represented, rather than a genuine remnant of his former self. Recognition that only death could end this confrontation filled Sanguinius with sorrow that went beyond personal grief to encompass the entire tragedy of the Civil War. The brother he had loved more than his own life had become something that threatened the existence of everything they had once fought to protect. No amount of loyalty or affection could change the reality that Horus's survival would doom humanity to extinction. The challenge issued and accepted marked the end of brotherhood and the beginning of cosmic judgment. When Sanguinius raised the spear of Telesto against the being who had once been his closest companion, he was not just defending the Imperium, but serving as the instrument through which the universe itself would determine whether order or chaos would ultimately prevail. Meanwhile, on Terra's surface, the Blood Angels' Legion was experiencing collective madness that defied all previous understanding of Space Marine psychology. The psychic bond that connected them to their Primarch transmitted his emotional state across impossible distances, flooding their consciousness with visions of the confrontation taking place aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Berserker fury unleashed by the Legion exceeded anything in recorded military history, transforming disciplined space marines into creatures of pure destruction who fought with supernatural effectiveness. They tore through traitor positions with strength that seemed to increase rather than diminish as casualties mounted, their battle cries echoing with harmonics that suggested inhuman vocal cords. The Red Thirst consumed entire companies simultaneously as the genetic flaw that had always plagued the Blood Angels reached its ultimate expression. Warriors who had controlled their bloodlust for decades found themselves unable to resist urges that overwhelmed every aspect of their consciousness. They fought not just for victory, but for the blood of their enemies, drinking deeply from wounds they inflicted, while their eyes glowed with inhuman light. First mass manifestation of the Black Rage began as Sanguinius faced his greatest trial, though its true nature would not be understood until after the angel's death. Blood Angels throughout the siege zone began experiencing hallucinations that placed them in battles they had never fought, wielding weapons they had never touched, and facing enemies that bore their Primarch's face. The cursor's full power was finally revealed as something that went beyond simple genetic flaw to represent fundamental corruption of the Space Marine creation process itself. The careful balance between human and post-human elements that had made the Astartes project successful was breaking down under pressure that the Emperor's original design had never anticipated facing. Captain Raldoron's desperate attempts at maintaining order represented one of the most heroic efforts in Imperial military history, though his success remained limited by forces beyond any individual's ability to control. The future chapter master found himself commanding warriors whose behavior had become more bestial than human, yet whose loyalty remained absolute even as their sanity crumbled. Communication with affected units became impossible as traditional command structures dissolved under the influence of visions that overrode conscious thought. Blood angels responded to orders that existed only in their hallucinations while ignoring actual commands from their officers. The result was tactical chaos that somehow achieved strategic effectiveness through mechanisms that defied military analysis. Medical intervention proved completely ineffective against conditions that transcended physical ailment to represent spiritual corruption on a fundamental level. Apothecaries who attempted to treat affected warriors often found themselves drawn into the same madness, as proximity to the Black Rage seemed to make it contagious in ways that violated biological possibility. The Legion's sanity hung by the thinnest thread while their Primarch faced the trial that would determine not just his own fate, but theirs as well. Every blow exchanged in the throne room of the Vengeful Spirit sent shockwaves through the psychic network that bound the Blood Angels to their gene father, pushing them closer to complete psychological collapse. Everything would be decided in moments that stretched across eternity, as the confrontation between brothers approached its inevitable climax. The angel who had spent his entire existence serving as humanity's symbol of hope and nobility was about to make the sacrifice that would preserve both, while condemning his sons to eternal torment. The tragedy of that choice would echo through 10,000 years of subsequent history, proving that even the greatest love sometimes demands the most terrible prices. The throne room of the Vengeful Spirit had become a cathedral of corruption, where reality itself bent to accommodate the presence of powers that should not exist in material space. Ancient Terran artifacts that had once symbolized humanity's greatest achievements now served as altars to entities whose very names corrupted the air around them. The walls pulsed with organic growth that seemed to respond to emotional states, brightening with anticipation as the two greatest of the Emperor's sons prepared to decide the fate of everything they had once loved. Sanguinius stepped forward across the threshold that separated him from his former brother, each footfall echoing through dimensions that mortal senses could not perceive. The spear of Telesto hummed with psychic energy that resonated through the ship's corrupted structure, while his wings spread wide in a display that combined majesty with unmistakable challenge. Despite everything that had changed, despite the corruption that had claimed his sibling's soul, the angel's love for Horus remained undimmed even as he accepted the necessity of destroying what his brother had become. Horus stood waiting in the center of the vast chamber, his form no longer entirely human, yet retaining enough familiar features to make his transformation heartbreaking rather than simply monstrous. The War Master's armor had fused with his flesh, in places creating hybrid surfaces that gleamed with supernatural light, while pulsing with energies that violated natural law. His face, once noble enough to inspire absolute loyalty from millions of followers, now bore marks of corruption that spoke of bargains made with entities whose prices extracted pieces of the soul itself. The initial exchange between the brothers carried weight that transcended mere words, each speaking truths that cut deeper than any physical weapon could reach. Sanguinius offered forgiveness for sins that had shattered the galaxy, while Horus responded with invitations to power that could have reshaped reality according to the angel's desires. The conversation revealed how completely their positions had reversed since the Great Crusade's beginning, when Horus had been the loyal son and Sanguinius the one who sometimes questioned their father's methods. Recognition passed between them that this confrontation represented more than personal conflict, but served as a cosmic judgment about the nature of existence itself. The dark gods had invested too much in Horus's corruption to allow redemption through simple conversation, while the Emperor's love for both sons had created a situation where only absolute victory or complete defeat could resolve the crisis threatening humanity's survival. When words proved inadequate to bridge the gap that corruption had created between them, both brothers moved to combat with the fluid grace that had made them legends throughout the galaxy. Sanguinius launched himself into the air, his wings carrying him above Horus's initial strike, while the spear of Telesto carved a burning arc through the corrupted atmosphere. The War Master's response demonstrated strength that had been enhanced beyond even Primarch capabilities, his claws extending with supernatural speed to intercept the Angel's aerial assault. The duel that followed transcended conventional combat to become something approaching a force of nature unleashed within the confines of material space. Each blow exchanged between the brothers created shockwaves that rippled through multiple dimensions, while their weapons carved wounds in reality itself that bled energies too dangerous for mortal eyes to witness directly. The Angel's perfect aerial mobility allowed him to strike from angles that should have been impossible, while Horus's enhanced strength let him shrug off attacks that would have crippled normal Primarchs. Sanguinius fought with technique that represented the pinnacle of everything the Great Crusade had sought to achieve, his every movement flowing with aesthetic beauty that transformed violence into art. The spear of Telesto became an extension of his will, its psychic-enhanced blade cutting through defenses that conventional weapons could not penetrate, while channeling the Angel's own spiritual energy into attacks that targeted both body and soul. Horus's combat style revealed the true cost of his bargains with chaos, as supernatural abilities came at the price of the discipline and honor that had once defined his approach to warfare. His attacks carried corruption that sought to infect whatever they touched, while his very presence generated despair that could have broken lesser opponents before the first blow was struck. The enhanced strength that the War Master displayed went beyond mere physical augmentation to represent fundamental alteration of what it meant to be human. Where Sanguinius remained recognizably the being he had always been, despite his supernatural abilities, Horus had become something entirely other, a hybrid creature that retained memories of humanity while serving purposes that were entirely alien. The battle's progression revealed the terrible truth that love alone could not overcome the corruption that had claimed the War Master's essence. Every technique that Sanguinius employed, every appeal to shared memory or brotherhood, met with responses that demonstrated how completely Horus had been transformed. The brother who had once been closest to the Angel's heart now existed only as a mockery of everything he had represented, a living reminder of how far the mighty could fall when they abandoned the principles that had elevated them. Yet even as the futility of redemption became apparent, Sanguinius continued to fight with restraint that honored their former relationship. The Angel could have employed tactics that might have granted advantage through ruthless exploitation of openings, but his nobility prevented him from treating this battle like any other conflict. He fought not to humiliate or torture, but to grant his brother the clean death that was the only mercy he could still provide. The first critical moment came when Horus's claws found purchase in the angel's armor, their supernatural sharpness cutting through protection that had turned aside daemon weapons during the siege. The wounds they inflicted carried more than physical damage, as chaos corruption sought to spread through the angel's perfect form and claim another of the Emperor's sons for the dark gods. Sanguinius's resistance to corruption proved absolute in ways that surprised even Horus, whose enhanced perception allowed him to see how the dark god's influence simply could not take hold in the angel's soul. This immunity, which should have been a source of strength, instead became a source of frustration that drove the War Master to escalate his attacks beyond what strategic necessity demanded. The angel's aerial superiority began to erode as Horus adapted to fighting an opponent who could attack from 3 dimensions rather than just 2. The War Master's enhanced reflexes allowed him to predict and counter maneuvers that would have succeeded against any other opponent, while his supernatural strength let him leap distances that should have been impossible even for a Primarch. Momentum shifted repeatedly throughout the battle, as each combatant gained temporary advantages only to have them countered by techniques that pushed the boundaries of what Space Marine capabilities could achieve. The rhythm of their combat created a deadly dance that might have continued indefinitely if not for the cosmic forces that demanded resolution of the conflict that was paralyzing the galaxy. The turning point arrived when Sanguinius chose to abandon defensive caution in favor of an all-out assault that would either grant decisive victory or create the opening that Horus needed to achieve his own triumph. The angel's final attack carried every ounce of skill, strength, and spiritual power that he possessed, the spear of Telesto blazing with energies that seemed to draw from the very foundations of reality itself. Horus met this ultimate assault with power that revealed the true extent of his enhancement by the Chaos Gods. His response demonstrated strength that no single being should have been able to wield, while his speed exceeded what even Primarch reflexes should have been capable of achieving. The collision of their final attacks created an explosion of force that shattered the throne room's structural integrity while sending shockwaves through every level of the Vengeful Spirit. The angel's wings, those magnificent appendages that had inspired hope in millions of Imperial citizens, were torn away in the exchange as Horus's claws found their mark with supernatural precision. The agony of losing what had been both his greatest gift and his defining characteristic drove Sanguinius to his knees, while blood that had never been spilled before stained the corrupted deck beneath him. Horus's moment of doubt came not from any remaining trace of brotherhood, but from recognition that the angel's sacrifice had achieved something the War Master had not anticipated. In striking down Sanguinius, he had created a weakness in his own spiritual defenses that made him vulnerable to intervention by the one being in the galaxy whose power still exceeded his own. The killing blow that ended Sanguinius's existence carried more than physical force, as Horus sought to ensure that no trace of the angel's nobility could survive to inspire future resistance. Yet even as his life ebbed away, Sanguinius achieved a final victory by demonstrating that corruption could claim bodies and minds, but could never touch souls that remained truly pure. The Emperor's arrival to find his son's broken body created a moment of grief and rage that transcended normal emotional responses to approach the level of cosmic forces, reshaping reality around their focus. The master of mankind's love for the angel had been one of the few purely positive emotions that remained within his increasingly divine consciousness, and its violent severance unleashed power that the chaos gods themselves had not anticipated. The crack in Horus's armor that Sanguinius's death had created proved to be literal as well as metaphorical, as the angel's sacrifice had weakened the spiritual protections that made the War Master invulnerable to conventional attack. This weakness would provide the opening that the Emperor needed to achieve final victory, though the cost of that triumph would leave humanity's guardian broken in ways that 10,000 years of subsequent history would fail to heal. The psychic scream that accompanied Sanguinius's death tore through the warp with such intensity that astropaths throughout the galaxy collapsed in agony, their minds overwhelmed by grief too pure and terrible for mortal consciousness to process. On Terra, every blood angel felt their gene father's final moments as if they were their own, experiencing the ripping away of his wings, the piercing of his hearts, and the cold embrace of death that claimed the most perfect of the Emperor's sons. The Emperor's confrontation with Horus in the immediate aftermath of the angel's death became the stuff of legend, though few surviving witnesses possessed the spiritual strength necessary to observe such cosmic forces in direct conflict. The master of mankind's rage burned with intensity that made stars seem dim by comparison, while his grief for the favored son transformed into power that rewrote the fundamental laws governing the space around them. The weakness that Sanguinius's sacrifice had created in Horus's defenses proved exactly as decisive as the angel's visions had foretold. The War Master's spiritual armor, previously impenetrable even to the Emperor's direct assault, now showed cracks that allowed the master of mankind's power to penetrate to the corrupted essence beneath. What followed was not mere combat, but cosmic judgment rendered through forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of material reality. Horus's final defeat came not from superior strength or technique, but from the realization that his victory had already been transformed into defeat by the angel's willing sacrifice. The corruption that had seemed to grant him unlimited power revealed itself as a trap that had made him vulnerable to precisely the kind of noble love that Sanguinius represented. In destroying his brother, the War Master had unknowingly destroyed the protections that kept him safe from his father's wrath. The moment of Horus's obliteration created a void in the warp that drew in energies from across multiple dimensions, while the Chaos Gods retreated from Terra rather than face the full fury of the Emperor's unleashed power. Yet this victory came at a cost that would echo through 10 millennia of subsequent Imperial history, as the Emperor's battle with his most beloved and most corrupted son left him so damaged that only internment within the Golden Throne could preserve his existence. The Emperor's internment transformed him from active ruler to spiritual beacon, though the full implications of this change would not become apparent for generations. The master of mankind, who had once walked among his people as a living god, became instead a distant presence whose will could only be interpreted through intermediaries and whose guidance arrived in fragments that required faith rather than understanding to follow. Chaos forces throughout the Sol system began their retreat within hours of Horus's destruction, as the psychic networks that had coordinated their assault collapsed with the death of their primary focal point. Daemon engines that had seemed invulnerable to conventional weapons suddenly became susceptible to standard Imperial firepower, while Chaos Space Marines found their superhuman abilities reduced to merely exceptional rather than supernatural levels. The retreat was not orderly withdrawal, but panicked flight as entities that had expected easy victory discovered that their greatest champion's defeat had left them exposed to Imperial retaliation. Many Traitor Legion units were destroyed during their attempted escape, though enough survived to establish strongholds in the Eye of Terra and other regions where Chaos influence remained strong. Terra's survival was assured, but the planet that emerged from the siege bore scars that would never fully heal. Entire continents had been transformed into wastelands where reality itself remained unstable, while the population had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war numbers. The Imperial Palace, though still standing, required extensive reconstruction that would consume decades of effort and vast resources. The Imperium's survival came at a cost that fundamentally altered its character and capabilities. The dream of human unity and expansion that had driven the Great Crusade was replaced by a grim determination to simply endure in a galaxy that had proven far more hostile than anyone had imagined. The optimism that had characterized the Crusade's early years gave way to the paranoia and authoritarianism that would define Imperial culture for millennia to come. Blood Angels across the galaxy experienced collective trauma that went beyond anything in recorded Space Marine history. The psychic bond that had connected them to Sanguinius did not end with his death, but instead became a permanent conduit through which they would relive his final moments for the rest of their existence. The Black Rage that had first manifested during the siege became a defining characteristic of the Legion, claiming warriors at random intervals and transforming them into berserkers who fought with supernatural fury until death claimed them. The Legion's decimation extended beyond simple casualty figures to encompass fundamental changes in their character and capabilities. Warriors who had once been renowned for their discipline and cultural sophistication found themselves struggling with bloodlust that threatened to overwhelm their rational minds during every combat engagement. The Red Thirst, which had previously been a manageable flaw, became an omnipresent challenge that required constant vigilance to control. Survivors struggled with grief that transcended normal emotional responses to encompass spiritual damage that no amount of time could heal. They had not merely lost their Primarch, but had experienced his death as if it were their own, creating trauma that was literally written into their genetic structure and would be passed on to every future generation of Blood Angels. Captain Ralderon's leadership during this crisis demonstrated courage that exceeded even the legendary standards of the Astartes. The future chapter master found himself responsible for holding together a legion whose members were experiencing collective madness while maintaining combat effectiveness sufficient to contribute to the war's final phases. His innovations in managing the Black Rage would become essential components of Blood Angel's doctrine for millennia to come. The establishment of protocols for dealing with afflicted warriors required balancing compassion for brothers who were no longer entirely sane with tactical necessity that demanded continued military effectiveness. The death company that emerged from these protocols represented both solution and tragedy, providing a means for Black Rage victims to achieve honorable death while serving the Emperor's cause. Training modifications developed during this period focused on mental discipline techniques that could help blood angels resist the onset of madness, though these methods proved only partially effective against a condition that was fundamentally spiritual rather than psychological. The Legion's recruitment standards were altered to emphasize candidates with exceptional mental fortitude, though even the strongest minds proved vulnerable to the curse that Sanguinius's death had made permanent. Chapter reorganization under the Codex Astartes provided structure that helped the surviving Blood Angels adapt to their changed circumstances, though the implementation of Guilliman's reforms required significant modification to accommodate the unique challenges posed by the genetic curse. The division of the Legion into separate chapters allowed for better management of the Black Rage, while preserving the tactical flexibility that had made the Blood Angels effective during the Great Crusade. The establishment of successor chapters created new challenges as the genetic flaw spread to warriors who had no direct connection to Sanguinius, but inherited his curse through the gene seed implantation process. Each new chapter founded using Blood Angels' genetic material carried the same burden of madness and bloodlust, ensuring that the Angel's sacrifice would affect generations of warriors yet to be born. Integration with other Imperial forces proved difficult as the Blood Angels' changed behavior created suspicion among allies who had previously trusted them without reservation. The savage fury that characterized their combat style made other Imperial commanders reluctant to deploy them in situations that required restraint or precision, while their unpredictable episodes of madness made long-term planning around their capabilities nearly impossible. The mourning that gripped the entire Imperium following news of Sanguinius's death created a spiritual crisis that threatened to undermine the very foundations of Imperial civilization. The Angel had represented everything noble about humanity's expansion among the stars, and his loss left a void that no other figure could fill. Citizens who had found hope in his example struggled to maintain faith in an Imperium that had proven unable to protect even its greatest champions. Sanguinius's elevation to sainthood occurred through popular acclaim rather than official decree, as ordinary Imperial citizens began venerating the Angel's memory without waiting for ecclesiastical approval. Shrines appeared throughout the galaxy wherever his image had been displayed, while stories of his sacrifice spread through Imperial culture with a speed that suggested supernatural intervention. His body's recovery from the Vengeful Spirit became a sacred duty that required the combined efforts of multiple Imperial agencies. The task of retrieving the Angel's remains from the corrupted environment of Horus's flagship posed challenges that went beyond mere logistics to encompass spiritual dangers that could have claimed additional lives if not handled with appropriate reverence and caution. Preparation for interment required techniques that had never been attempted before, as normal preservation methods proved inadequate for a being whose very essence had been altered by supernatural forces. The Angel's body showed no signs of decay despite the violence of his death, suggesting that his purity had transcended physical laws in ways that made him as much relic as corpse. The tomb construction on Baal became a project that consumed the resources of entire sectors while providing employment for craftsmen whose skills had been developed specifically for creating monuments worthy of a demigod. The structure that emerged combined ancient Baal architectural traditions with Imperial engineering capabilities to create something that was simultaneously mausoleum, cathedral, and fortress. Establishment of Sanguinala as an Imperial holiday reflected the widespread desire to honor the angel's memory, while providing a focal point for grief that might otherwise have paralyzed imperial society. The celebration combined elements of mourning and joy, acknowledging both the tragedy of Sanguinius's death and the victory that his sacrifice had made possible. 10,000 years of faithful service following the heresy demonstrated that the Blood Angels' curse had not diminished their loyalty to the Emperor or their effectiveness as his warriors, though it had fundamentally altered how they approached both warfare and their own existence. Each generation of Blood Angels learned to live with a knowledge that madness waited in their future, that at some unpredictable moment they would experience their Gene Father's death as if it were their own, and fight until death claimed them in turn. The Red Thirst evolved over the millennia, from manageable flaw to omnipresent challenge that required constant vigilance to control. Blood Angels, who had initially hoped that time might weaken their genetic burden, instead discovered that successive generations showed stronger rather than weaker manifestations of the curse. The hunger for blood became so integral to their nature that abstaining from it entirely proved impossible, forcing the chapter to develop rituals and practices that channeled the craving in spiritually acceptable directions. The evolution of the Black Rage revealed patterns that suggested supernatural rather than purely genetic causation. Warriors could serve for centuries without showing any signs of the madness, then suddenly experience visions so vivid that they became lost in their Gene Father's memories. The randomness of these episodes made long-term planning difficult while creating constant tension within the chapter's ranks. Death Company. Formation became both solution and ongoing tragedy, as the Blood Angels developed protocols for managing warriors who had succumbed to the Black Rage. These afflicted brothers were honored for their sacrifice, while being channeled toward deaths that would serve the Emperor's cause rather than waste their remaining combat effectiveness. The Death Company's black armor and skull helmets became symbols of noble madness that inspired both respect and sorrow throughout the Imperium. Sanguinary priests emerged as a unique institution within the Blood Angels that combined medical expertise with spiritual guidance, their primary responsibility being the maintenance of gene seed purity, despite the hereditary curse that affected every implantation. These warrior chaplains developed techniques for monitoring genetic degradation while providing counseling for brothers who struggled with the psychological burden of inevitable madness. The gene seed purity maintenance required innovations that pushed Imperial biotechnology to its limits while remaining within the bounds of acceptable practice, according to Mechanicus doctrine. Sanguinary priests learned to identify and compensate for genetic drift that might worsen the curse, while preserving the beneficial characteristics that made Blood Angels exceptional warriors even by Space Marine standards. Chapter organization adapted to accommodate the unique challenges posed by the genetic curse, while maintaining combat effectiveness that met or exceeded Codex Astartes standards. Companies were structured to ensure that the loss of warriors to the Black Rage would not compromise operational capability, while recruitment was adjusted to maintain force strength, despite higher than normal casualty rates from non-combat causes. The ongoing nobility demonstrated by Blood Angels, despite their curse, became legendary throughout the Imperial military, as these warriors proved that genetic flaws need not determine moral character. They fought with particular distinction in campaigns where civilian protection was paramount, their own suffering making them especially sympathetic to the plight of innocent populations caught in war zones. Cultural impact throughout the Imperium reflected the Blood Angels' unique position as simultaneously blessed and cursed warriors whose example inspired both admiration and pity. Their reputation for artistic achievement continued even as the Black Rage made long-term cultural projects increasingly difficult to complete. Many of the galaxy's greatest works of art bore Blood Angels' signatures, created by warriors who knew their time might be limited but refused to abandon beauty in favor of purely military pursuits. Sanguinius, as a symbol of imperial ideals, transcended his role as a Primarch to become something approaching a patron saint of sacrifice and nobility. His image appeared in countless shrines throughout the galaxy, while his words were quoted by imperial preachers as examples of how duty should take precedence over personal survival. The angel's example provided moral guidance for imperial citizens facing their own choices between safety and service. Imperial art and literature drew heavily on themes derived from Sanguinius's story, with particular emphasis on the tension between nobility and curse that defined his legacy. Epic poems describing his sacrifice became required reading in imperial schools, while artistic depictions of his final battle with Horus served as focal points for meditation in countless cathedrals throughout human space. Inspiration for other chapters and imperial forces came not just from the Blood Angels' combat effectiveness, but from their demonstration that even the most challenging circumstances could not break properly motivated warriors. Chapters facing their own genetic or cultural challenges often looked to the Blood Angels as examples of how flaws could be transformed into sources of strength rather than weakness. The Sanguinala celebration evolved from simple memorial service to one of the Imperium's most important holidays, providing annual opportunity for reflection on themes of sacrifice and redemption that resonated throughout imperial culture. The holiday's traditions combined mourning for the angel's death with celebration of the victory his sacrifice had made possible, creating emotional complexity that encouraged deeper contemplation of duty and devotion. Successor chapters carried the curse to new regions of the galaxy, each developing their own approaches to managing the genetic flaw while maintaining the noble traditions inherited from their gene father. The angels in Carmine, angels sanguine, blood drinkers, and dozens of other chapters created variations on Blood Angels' practices while sharing the same fundamental burden of inevitable madness. The flaws spread through gene seed affected not just the original Blood Angels, but every chapter founded using Sanguinius's genetic legacy. This created a community of suffering that transcended normal chapter boundaries, as warriors from different organizations shared experiences that only those carrying the same curse could truly understand. Inter-chapter cooperation among Sanguinius's descendants often exceeded that found between other genetic lineages. Genetic research, conducted over the millennia, attempted to identify methods for eliminating or reducing the curse's effects, though success remained elusive despite the best efforts of imperial science. Some apothecaries theorized that the curse was so fundamental to Blood Angels' genetics that removing it might eliminate the beneficial characteristics that made them exceptional warriors. Balance between angel and beast became the defining struggle for every blood angel, requiring constant vigilance and spiritual discipline that went beyond normal Space Marine training. Warriors learned to recognize the warning signs of impending black rage, while developing personal techniques for managing the red thirst that honored their chapter's traditions while preserving their sanity. Hope for eventual cure drove much of the Blood Angels' scientific research efforts, though many warriors came to accept that the curse might be an integral part of their identity rather than simply a flaw to be corrected. This acceptance led to philosophical developments that embraced suffering as a path to greater understanding, while maintaining faith that the Emperor's plan included eventual redemption for Sanguinius's sons. The continuing curse affected recruitment patterns as the Blood Angels sought candidates who possessed not just physical qualifications, but psychological resilience that could withstand the additional burdens imposed by their genetic heritage. Selection processes emphasized mental fortitude and spiritual stability, while screening for individuals whose character suggested they could maintain nobility even under extreme psychological pressure. Training modifications developed over the centuries focused on preparing new Blood Angels for the unique challenges they would face, while building mental discipline that could delay or mitigate the onset of the Black Rage. These programs combined standard Space Marine conditioning with specialized techniques derived from ancient Baal meditation practices and Imperial psychological theory. Chapter traditions evolved to incorporate the curse as a central element rather than an unfortunate side effect, creating ceremonies and practices that honored both the nobility inherited from Sanguinius and the suffering that came with his genetic legacy. The Red Grail became an even more significant symbol, as rituals surrounding it provided structured means for managing the blood hunger that affected all Blood Angels. The ongoing search for understanding drove theological as well as scientific inquiry, as chapter chaplains sought to comprehend the spiritual dimensions of their affliction. Some theorized that the curse served a divine purpose that would become apparent only when the Emperor's grand design reached its completion, while others viewed it as a test of faith that each warrior must pass individually. Whispers spoke of the Angel's possible return during the galaxy's darkest hours, though such hopes remained unspoken rather than official doctrine. Some Blood Angels reported visions of their gene father that seemed too vivid to be mere hallucinations, while others claimed to feel his presence during moments of extreme crisis when supernatural intervention seemed the only explanation for their survival. Some claimed his spirit still watched over his sons during their most desperate battles, providing guidance that came not through words, but through intuitive understanding of tactics and strategy that exceeded normal Space Marine capabilities. These experiences were personal rather than institutional, creating individual faith rather than chapter doctrine. In the darkest times, miracles still occurred that bore the hallmarks of angelic intervention, though whether these represented actual supernatural aid or simply the power of faith to inspire extraordinary achievement remained a matter of individual interpretation. Blood Angels facing impossible odds sometimes found themselves capable of feats that defied rational explanation, fighting with effectiveness that suggested assistance from sources beyond the material realm. The Blood Angels of the 41st and 42nd millennia faced challenges that their predecessors could never have imagined, as the galaxy has become an even darker and more dangerous place than the one their gene father knew during the heresy. The great rift that tore reality apart has brought chaos closer to the material realm than ever before, while new Xenos threats emerge from regions of space that were previously thought empty. Yet through all these trials, Sanguinius's sons continue to embody the nobility and sacrifice that their Primarch represented, proving that even 10,000 years of suffering cannot break spirits that are truly pure. Commander Dante has carried the burden of Chapter Master for over 1,500 years, making him one of the oldest space marines in Imperial history, and a living link to traditions that stretch back to the dark days following the heresy. His longevity has allowed him to witness the full scope of how the curse affects his chapter over extended periods, providing insights that younger leaders could never achieve. The weight of watching generations of battle brothers succumb to the Black Rage has left marks on his soul that go deeper than any physical wound. Yet his faith in the Emperor's plan remains unshaken. The millennial leadership that Dante has provided represents both blessing and burden for the Blood Angels, as his accumulated wisdom comes at the cost of isolation that few beings could endure without losing their sanity. He has outlived thousands of warriors who called him father and brother, watching them fall to enemies, both external and internal, while maintaining the strength necessary to inspire new generations of recruits. His example demonstrates that duty can sustain a warrior through trials that would break lesser souls, though the price of such endurance becomes visible in moments when he believes himself unobserved. The Great Rift's creation has intensified daemon activity throughout Imperial space in ways that particularly affect the Blood Angels, as entities of chaos seem drawn to warriors whose spiritual purity creates such stark contrast with their genetic curse. The psychic storms that accompany warp phenomena trigger the Black Rage more frequently than before, while the Red Thirst grows stronger in the presence of chaos corruption. Yet these same challenges have also revealed new depths of heroism among Sanguinius's sons, who fight with desperation born from knowledge that failure would dishonor their gene father's sacrifice. Increased daemon manifestations test the Blood Angels in ways that go beyond simple combat effectiveness to challenge their fundamental identity as noble warriors. Daemons that embody bloodlust and rage attempt to corrupt the chapter's afflicted members, offering power that could ease their suffering in exchange for abandoning their loyalty to the Emperor. These temptations prove particularly dangerous for warriors already struggling with the Black Rage, as madness makes them more susceptible to influences that would never affect rational minds. Guilliman's return to active leadership has created both hope and uncertainty for the Blood Angels, as the resurrected Primarch brings with him knowledge of how the Imperium was supposed to function, combined with pragmatic acceptance of how it actually operates. His interactions with Dante have revealed deep respect for what the Blood Angels have achieved, despite their curse, while his broader reforms offer potential solutions to problems that have plagued the chapter for millennia. The Primarch's impact on the chapter extends beyond simple administrative changes to encompass philosophical questions about the nature of duty and sacrifice that go to the heart of Blood Angels' identity. Guilliman's more practical approach to imperial governance sometimes conflicts with the idealistic nobility that the Blood Angels inherited from Sanguinius, creating tensions that require careful navigation to avoid undermining either tradition or progress. The ongoing search for a cure to the genetic curse has taken on new urgency as Imperial science advances to levels not seen since the dark age of technology, though success remains frustratingly elusive despite the best efforts of the Mechanicus and chapter apothecaries. Some researchers theorize that the curse is so fundamental to Blood Angel's genetics that removing it might eliminate the beneficial characteristics that make them exceptional warriors, while others argue that the spiritual dimensions of their affliction place it beyond the reach of purely scientific solutions. Recent discoveries in gene craft technology have provided tools that previous generations could never have imagined, yet application of these techniques to the Blood Angel's curse has produced disappointing results. Attempts to modify the gene seed have either failed completely or created new problems that prove worse than the original flaw, suggesting that Sanguinius's sacrifice created changes that transcend normal biological processes. Alternative approaches focusing on spiritual rather than scientific remedies have shown more promise, particularly those that incorporate elements from the angel's own teachings and the meditation practices developed on ancient Baal. Some blood angels have reported temporary relief from their symptoms through intensive prayer and fasting regimens, though these methods require commitment that few warriors can maintain while meeting their combat obligation. Theological significance has grown rather than diminished over the millennia, as Sanguinius's sacrifice has become central to Imperial doctrine about duty, sacrifice, and the relationship between individual desires and cosmic necessity. His example provides moral guidance for situations where the greater good requires personal loss, while his continued influence offers hope that death need not end one's service to the Emperor's cause. The angel's role in Imperial faith has evolved to encompass not just military inspiration, but spiritual comfort for citizens facing their own trials and hardships. Prayers to Sanguinius are particularly common among those who must choose between safety and duty, while his image appears in shrines dedicated to themes of noble sacrifice and redemption through suffering. Debate over his possible resurrection reflects broader theological questions about the nature of death and return that have become increasingly relevant as several Primarchs have emerged from millennia of absence. Some scholars argue that Sanguinius's sacrifice was so complete and perfect that resurrection would diminish its spiritual impact, while others contend that his return might be necessary for humanity's survival during the galaxy's final trials. Imperial doctrine regarding Primarch mortality has become more flexible as events have demonstrated that death does not necessarily represent permanent departure from the material realm. The Emperor's continued existence within the Golden Throne provides precedent for transcending normal limitations, while the return of other Primarchs suggests that cosmic forces may restore champions when their service becomes essential for humanity's survival. Future implications of Sanguinius's legacy extend beyond the Blood Angels to encompass all of humanity's struggle against the darkness that threatens to consume the galaxy. His example of willing sacrifice for the greater good provides a template for heroism that transcends individual survival, while his demonstration that purity can persist even in the most challenging circumstances offers hope that corruption need not be inevitable. The curse's eventual resolution remains one of the great mysteries facing Imperial science and theology, with potential solutions ranging from technological breakthrough to divine intervention. Some theorists propose that the curse serves a purpose that will become apparent only during humanity's final crisis, when the Blood Angel's unique combination of nobility and suffering might prove essential for victory against ultimate darkness. The connection between Sanguinius's sacrifice and the Emperor's continued existence suggests that the Angel's death may have contributed to maintaining the psychic beacon that guides Imperial ships through the warp. This theory, if correct, would mean that his suffering continues to serve humanity's needs, even 10,000 years after his physical death, making any attempt at resurrection potentially disastrous for Imperial navigation and communication. His son's role in humanity's final battles seems increasingly certain as the galaxy approaches what many believe to be its last age, when the forces of order and chaos will clash in conflicts that will determine the ultimate fate of all intelligent life. The Blood Angel's unique combination of exceptional combat ability and intimate familiarity with suffering may make them ideally suited for the sacrifices that such desperate times will demand. The Angel's sacrifice, as the key to Imperial survival, has become more rather than less relevant as threats to human civilization have multiplied and intensified. His demonstration that individual desires must sometimes be subordinated to cosmic necessity provides guidance for decisions that may determine whether humanity survives the trials ahead or succumbs to forces that have been gathering strength for millennia. Legacy inspiring future generations continues to grow as each new threat reveals fresh applications for the principles that Sanguinius embodied. Young Imperial citizens learn his story as an example of how personal virtue can triumph over circumstances, while veteran warriors find renewed purpose in emulating his willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. The eternal choice that faced Sanguinius aboard the Vengeful Spirit echoes through every decision made by Imperial servants who must balance personal desires against duty to the greater good. His example proves that such choices, however painful, can be made with grace and nobility that transform individual suffering into cosmic victory. Every Blood Angel faces the same fundamental choice daily as they struggle to maintain their humanity, despite the curse that seeks to reduce them to monsters driven by hunger and rage. Their success in this ongoing battle honors their Gene Father's memory, while proving that his sacrifice continues to bear fruit through the actions of those who carry his genetic legacy. Nobility versus savagery represents the eternal struggle not just for the Blood Angels, but for all of humanity as the galaxy grows darker and more dangerous. Sanguinius's example shows that choosing nobility despite overwhelming pressure toward brutality is both possible and necessary, providing hope that civilization can survive even in the grim darkness of the far future. The Angel's example, lighting the way forward, offers guidance for navigating moral complexity that increases rather than decreases as humanity faces threats that challenge not just physical survival, but spiritual integrity. His demonstration that death can be preferable to corruption provides a standard for evaluating choices that might otherwise seem impossible to make correctly. His sacrifice, proving that death can mean victory, offers ultimate comfort to those who fear that their own efforts may prove inadequate to preserve what they value most. Sanguinius showed that apparent defeat can become triumph when approached with proper understanding of what truly matters, transforming death from ultimate failure into the highest form of service. In the grim darkness of the far future, Where there is only war, one angel's sacrifice continues to shine as proof that even in the darkest times, nobility and love can triumph over corruption and hate. Sanguinius chose death so that humanity might live, and 10,000 years later, his sons carry that same burden and that same hope into every battle they fight. The great angel's story reminds us that heroes are not those who never fall, but those who choose to fall in service of something greater than themselves. His wings may have been torn away, his blood may have stained the cold deck of the Vengeful Spirit, but his spirit soars eternal, guiding humanity through the endless night toward whatever dawn awaits beyond the darkness.